Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into one of the tightest, most breath-stealing chapters of history. Quite literally, you're about to get laced into a Victorian corset, and let me be clear, you probably won't survive this. Not just because the whalebone boning is jabbing into your ribs, or because the waist cinches down to the circumference of a loaf of bread, but because it represents the entire straitjacket of Victorian morality. But before we go further, do me a favour. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I don't want pity clicks. I want you on this journey with me because you actually vibe with these late night dives. Oh, and while you're at it, tell me your city and the time where you are. I love knowing who's up with me in this strange hour. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you're standing in front of the mirror. It's 1845. And your maid is yanking the strings of your corset so tight your lungs start filing complaints. The ideal waist is under 20 inches, and you're aiming for that magical number because society insists the smaller your waist, the purer your soul. Every gasp you take reminds you that breathing is optional, but being desirable is not. And here's the kicker. This isn't just about fashion. The corset becomes a symbol of control, not only of your body but of your desire. You want to feel something? Well, you're too busy staying upright and making sure you don't faint in public. Historically, corsets go way back, but the Victorian period elevated them into a near-religious requirement. Medical journals at the time argued that women's reproductive health would suffer without proper support. That's your historical fact for tonight. Some doctors swore corsets actually improve fertility by keeping everything in place. Of course, now we know they were more likely to deform ribs, cause fainting, and compress internal organs until they resembled an accordion that's been left out in the rain. Romantic, right? Here's the quirky fringe fact. There were actually tight-lacing clubs, secret societies of sorts, where women competed to see who could achieve the smallest waist, swapping measurements like trading cards. Imagine a group of Victorian ladies whispering over tea about whether Lucy managed to get down to 15 inches yet. This wasn't just vanity. It was almost a fetishized pursuit. And yes, men were often lurking around these clubs, egging it on. The corset was supposed to hide desire, but sometimes it fueled a completely different one. But scholars still debate this whole corset thing. Was it truly just an instrument of oppression, forced on women by patriarchal fashion standards? Or was it also a way for women to play with beauty, to manipulate appearance, and dare I say, to flirt with power in a subtle form? Some historians argue women wore corsets because they liked the look, and even today you'll find people who find vintage corsetry empowering. Others insist it was nothing short of daily torture disguised as elegance. You can see the tension here. One side calls it agency, the other calls it imprisonment. As you shuffle through the drawing room in your laced-up state, you notice something peculiar. Every restriction has a way of amplifying what it's supposed to suppress. You can't run, you can't bend freely, you can't even laugh without feeling stitches burst. But isn't that exactly what draws attention? Every gesture becomes dramatic, every feint a small performance. It's almost as if society choreographed women into fragile dolls, forcing desire into silence while paradoxically making them the centre of an unspoken theatre. Now picture the daily rituals. In the morning, your maid helps you into not one, not two, but multiple layers. Chemise, corset, bustle, petticoat, gown. By the time you're dressed, you feel like you're armoured against more than just the chill of London fog. You're armoured against your own impulses too. The physical rigidity echoes the mental one. And yet, underneath the lace and steel, you're very aware of the body that the world is trying so hard to ignore. That's the paradox you'll keep bumping into throughout this journey. In trying to erase women's desire, Victorians often ended up magnifying it. Let's add a little humour here. Imagine you're at a ball, candlelight flickering, violins scraping away. You're trying to glide gracefully, but honestly, you're just praying you won't pass out mid-waltz. The gentlemen are whispering compliments, but you can barely hear them over the sound of your ribs cracking in Morse code. When people say romance was swooning in the Victorian era, they aren't speaking metaphorically. It was literally women collapsing from lack of oxygen. If there was ever a convenient excuse to duck out of awkward conversation, this was it. Oh dear, I fainted. How clumsy of me. But there's also this quiet rebellion. Diaries from the time reveal women who wrote about loosening their corsets at night, about feeling that rush of breath as if they'd just broken free from prison. Some even wrote about the sensuality of the release, like letting desire out of a cage. That part never made it into the etiquette manuals, but you can almost hear it whispered between lines of handwriting, cramped and secretive. And while society preached purity, the corset carried undertones that people were perfectly aware of. Men saw the shape, the accentuated bust, the impossibly tiny waist. Desire was denied in words but displayed in silhouette. That's the Victorian contradiction in a nutshell. Don't talk about sex, but mould every visible inch of your body to hint at it. You, standing there in your reflection, might start to wonder, what happens if you just say no to the corset? Well, that would put you at the fringes, among the dress reformers who lobbied for rational clothing. They were mocked relentlessly, painted as unladylike, even dangerous. Because heaven forbid a woman could breathe properly and walk at more than 2 miles per hour without looking indecent. So as the candlelight flickers on the polished wood floors of your Victorian bedroom and the clock ticks into another restrained evening, you're caught between two worlds. One demands silence, stillness, the denial of desire. The other, the private one, whispers rebellion, small gasps of freedom between the laces. You know this corset isn't just shaping your waist. It's shaping your very sense of self and what you're allowed to feel. And while tonight you go along with it, tightening the strings and straightening your spine, you also know a secret. The body remembers. It remembers the squeeze, but it also remembers the release. And that memory, that little flicker of desire, never quite goes away. The corset comes off at night, but the silence stays. You're a young Victorian girl, and desire isn't something anyone explains to you directly. No one sits you down and says, by the way, someday you might want things that go beyond lace gloves and tea parties. Instead, lessons arrive in hushed tones, through careful avoidance. Silence itself becomes a kind of curriculum. If you're lucky, your mother or aunt hands you a slim etiquette book filled with instructions about modesty, comportment, and how to faint gracefully without showing too much ankle. If you're unlucky, you just absorb the rules by osmosis, learning what not to say when your pulse quickens or your gaze lingers too long. This is where Victorian social engineering excels, shaping girls not through open lectures, but through subtle corrections. That time you giggled too loudly at a boy's joke. A raised eyebrow shuts you down. The way your hand brushed too close during a card game. Suddenly you're being redirected to the piano. Every little slip is caught and smoothed over, until you begin to anticipate the correction before it even happens. That anticipation becomes self-censorship, the constant inner voice telling you, don't look too eager, don't let your face give you away. Historically, education for middle and upper-class girls often involved finishing schools, where they were taught languages, music, embroidery, and the art of looking like you don't need anything. Here's your factual nugget. In Britain, some of these finishing schools explicitly banned girls from reading novels, especially anything remotely passionate, for fear it might stir the imagination. As if one chapter of a Bronte book could unravel the entire social fabric, which honestly, it sort of could. And here's a fringe fact for you. There were secret marriage manuals floating around, written in coded language, intended to prepare brides for their wedding night. These books weren't sold in respectable shops, but passed hand to hand, hidden in drawers or disguised with misleading titles like domestic hygiene. Imagine unwrapping what looks like a boring medical guide, only to find delicate descriptions of what a husband might expect, and, scandal of scandals, what a wife might feel. Scholars still debate how much Victorian girls actually knew before marriage. One camp argues they were deliberately kept in the dark heading to their wedding nights utterly bewildered. The other suggests that gossip networks, servants, novels and older siblings provided plenty of unofficial education. The truth probably lies in the middle. Some women grew up thinking babies arrived via a kiss, while others pieced together enough hints to feel both curious and terrified. Picture yourself 16 years old, perched on the edge of a settee during an afternoon visit. You're surrounded by lace curtains and the faint scent of lavender polish. Your chaperone sits close, a human shield against impropriety. The boy across the room dares to look at you a second too long. Your pulse skips. Your cheeks flush, but nothing in your training equips you to name what you're feeling. The word desire hasn't even been offered to you as part of your vocabulary. You've been taught to recognise virtue and vice, but the messy territory in between? That's the shadow world you're not supposed to acknowledge exists. The silence doesn't just cover physical longing, it covers emotional hunger too. Girls were encouraged to idolise the angel in the house, the selfless, patient woman who lived only for others. That angel didn't want, she gave. To admit otherwise would be to shatter the porcelain ideal. So when you catch yourself daydreaming about someone, or even just imagining a life that feels freer, you scold yourself. Your diary entries become cryptic little codes, filled with restless feelings or anxious strings. The ink hides the ache behind vague phrases because the language for honesty has been stripped away. And here's the ironic part. The very act of suppression makes desire more potent. Think about it. When you're told not to think about something, where does your mind go immediately? Exactly there. The Victorians unintentionally trained a whole generation of women to obsess over what they weren't allowed to acknowledge. Desire thrived in the margins, between sentences, in glances, in the spaces where silence pressed the hardest. Now imagine yourself sneaking at a book. Not a scandalous one, just a slightly romantic novel. Maybe Jane Eyre. You read it under covers by candlelight, heart racing at the descriptions of a man's gaze or a moment of forbidden closeness. For you, this is as dangerous as climbing a mountain, and if your mother were to catch you, the candle would be snuffed, the book confiscated, and you'd get a stern lecture about preserving your innocence. Yet the spark it lit inside you wouldn't go out so easily. The humour in this is almost tragic. Society went to such elaborate lengths to keep girls innocent that they ended up creating a whole culture of semi-clueless brides and repressed young women. Imagine a wedding night where both partners are fumbling around in the dark, neither fully briefed, each thinking the other is the expert. It sounds like the setup to a bad comedy sketch, but for many Victorians, it was the reality. Still, in that silence, small rebellions bloomed. Some girls kept more daring diaries, others whispered questions to cousins or friends. A few even found ways to indulge curiosity discreetly, through books, art, or secret experiments with touch they never dared name. It's not that desire disappeared, it just had to find a quieter way of living, hiding in plain sight, growing stronger under the cloak of prohibition. As you blow out the candle tonight, you realise that silence itself has been the greatest teacher. It's taught you to measure your words, to conceal your body, to bury your feelings under lace and obedience. But it's also sharpened your inner world, given you a secret language no one else can touch. In a way, silence has forced you to build a private universe of longing, one that no etiquette book could erase, no matter how tightly its pages are bound. So here you are, corseted and silenced into ladylike composure, and the next chapter of your life looms ahead, the marriage market. It isn't love at first sight or fate swooping in with violins, it's more like an auction dressed in lace. Every parlour visit, every country ball, every carefully orchestrated tea party is part of this grand theatre where women are presented, evaluated and, if fortune smiles, claimed. Desire in this setting is supposed to hide beneath layers of silk and social calculation. You're not meant to want a husband, you're supposed to need one, in the same way one needs a roof that doesn't leak, or a coal fire that actually warms the room. Let's be clear. In Victorian Britain, marriage wasn't just a personal milestone, it was a survival strategy. Without it, oublié, women risked being classified as spinsters or redundant women, a label so humiliating that it practically vibrated with pity. That's your historical fact tonight. Census data in the mid-1800s revealed a startling number of unmarried women, leading to hand-wringing editorials about how society would cope with this so-called surplus of unwed ladies. Newspapers fretted about them as though they were an unwanted glut of potatoes, not actual human beings with lives. But here's your quirky side note. Not all matchmaking happened in drawing rooms. Some Victorians relied on matrimonial advertisements, basically the 19th century version of online dating. In the pages of discreet publications, men and women would describe themselves with phrases like, "Gentleman of means seeks amiable lady with refined taste." These ads were controversial, considered slightly scandalous, yet they thrummed with the unspoken acknowledgement that not everyone could secure a match through polite society alone. Imagine scrolling through those little columns of coded longing, each one a reminder that even the stiffest world couldn't completely snuff out human desire. Now here's where scholars get tangled in debate. Was the marriage market entirely oppressive, or did it provide women with a subtle form of agency? Some historians argue that yes, it was a system built to trade women like property, with dowries and status points deciding futures more than hearts ever did. Others point out that clever women could manipulate the rules, using beauty, wit, or alliances to secure a match that gave them more freedom than spinsterhood ever could. Was it a trap or a chessboard where you could sometimes win a surprising checkmate? The answer, frustratingly, depends on whose diary you read. Now picture yourself at a summer garden party, parasol angled just so, cheeks pink with heat and perhaps a touch of nerves. Gentleman approaches, bowing slightly, and you're suddenly performing a script you've memorized without realizing. Smile modestly, speak politely, laugh, but not too loudly. All of this is choreographed not to reveal what you actually want, but to signal what you represent: respectability, purity, the promise of dutiful companionship. It's less about connection than about presenting yourself as a polished ornament for display. Desire doesn't vanish in this setting, it just learns to wear a mask. That flicker in your stomach when he touches your hand as he hands you a cup of tea, you smother it with small talk about the weather. The flush in your cheeks, you attribute it to the heat. The entire ritual trains you to redirect every sign of longing into something socially acceptable. What you want is irrelevant. What you can convey without scandal is everything. And yet, despite the rigid choreography, cracks appear. Couples sneak glances across crowded rooms. Fingers linger longer than etiquette allows. Behind the paper-thin politeness of conversation, actual attraction simmers. The irony is thick. Society designed the marriage market to erase desire, but it often created endless opportunities for its rehearsal, masked, distorted, but undeniably present. Let's add a pinch of humour here. Imagine standing in a receiving line at a ball being introduced to suitor after suitor like you're on display at a livestock fair. Each man bows, each one delivers a bland compliment, and you're meant to beam like a porcelain doll. Meanwhile, you're thinking, honestly, if one more man tells me my eyes are like sapphires, I'll scream. The comedy is in the monotony, the way individuality vanishes in the shuffle of ritualized courtship. But here's the thing. Beneath all the pomp, some women plotted. They looked beyond the polished gentleman toward matches that stirred something more. Diaries reveal subtle betrayals of the system, women marrying men of lesser wealth but greater personal charm, or refusing proposals altogether. Risking social doom rather than accepting a lifetime of suffocating indifference. Each refusal was a quiet rebellion, each choice a whispered assertion that desire did matter, even if society said otherwise. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Marriage didn't just determine your personal happiness, it controlled your economic security, your legal identity, even your right to own property. For most Victorian women, the law saw them as extensions of their husbands, with little independence once vows were spoken. So when you stood under those garden lanterns chatting about roses and rainfall, what was really at play was your entire future. And whether you admitted it or not, desire was hovering right there beside you, shaping decisions in ways no etiquette manual dared to acknowledge. Tonight, as you imagine yourself gliding back into the parlour, you realise the marriage market wasn't a clean transaction of dowries and family connections. It was messy, charged and filled with unspoken undercurrents. Women didn't deal with desire by ignoring it. They bent it, redirected it, sometimes weaponized it, and sometimes surrendered to it in secret. The game was never really about erasing longing. It was about disguising it well enough to survive another day under society's sharp gaze. You've made it through the suffocating corsets, the polite silences, and the marriage market, but now comes one of the most bizarre chapters in the Victorian saga, the age of hysteria doctors. Imagine this: desire is so unspeakable, so scandalous, that society rebrands it as an illness. You don't have passion, you have a nervous disorder. You don't want intimacy, you're suffering from hysteria. It's the ultimate rebranding scheme. Take something natural, slap a medical diagnosis on it, and suddenly it becomes a problem. Men in white coats get paid to treat. Here's your historical fact. In the 19th century, hysteria was one of the most commonly diagnosed conditions in women, with symptoms ranging from irritability to fainting, insomnia, anxiety, and, you guessed it, uncontrollable desire. Doctors described it as a wandering womb disorder, based on the ancient Greek belief that the uterus literally floated around the body causing trouble. Yes, they imagined it roaming like a lost balloon, bumping into organs and creating chaos. Science! And here's the fringe fact. The one that still makes modern audiences raise an eyebrow. One of the treatments for hysteria was pelvic massage performed by physicians. The goal was to induce what they politely called hysterical paroxysm, which, let's drop the euphemism, meant orgasm. Picture a Victorian doctor in a stiff collar, furrowed brow, presenting himself as a medical professional, while manually providing this treatment. The official line was that this was a purely clinical act, no different from setting a broken bone. Meanwhile, the women walked out of appointments feeling mysteriously calmer. But scholars debate the interpretation of this entire practice. Some argue that doctors genuinely saw it as medical procedure, completely divorced from sexuality, an awkward but earnest attempt to deal with restless patients. Others insist there's no way Victorian medicine was that oblivious. The very denial of female sexuality made it possible for men to frame pleasure as pathology. Still others point out the invention of early electromechanical vibrators, supposedly to spare doctors the physical strain of treating so many hysterical patients. Was this really about efficiency, or was it the birth of a sexual technology disguised as therapy? Now put yourself in the scene. You're sitting in a stuffy consulting room surrounded by the smell of medicinal herbs and leather-bound books. You've been told your sleeplessness, your irritability, even your daydreams are signs of an illness. You're not sick, you're simply alive, restless, maybe even desiring, but you don't have the language to argue. The doctor speaks with such authority, his pen scratching notes as if your humanity is a puzzle to be solved. And when he prescribes treatment, you obey, because what else can you do? Ooh. Society has made your body its laboratory. There's a tragic comedy to all of this. Women were discouraged from acknowledging their desires, yet entire industries sprouted up around curing them. It's like banning fire while simultaneously selling buckets of water and fireproof gloves. Everyone pretended not to see the contradiction. Husbands brought their wives to doctors as if to outsource the problem, muttering about nervous tempers or restlessness. Behind closed doors, the wives underwent procedures that no one dared frame honestly. Let's be real, the absurdity is almost cinematic. Imagine a waiting room full of Victorian women, each clutching parasols, each complaining of vague symptoms, all about to be treated for the same unmentionable condition. Doctors kept meticulous records, couching everything in Latin, so nothing looked improper on paper. A modern reader can barely keep from laughing. Here was a whole culture constructing elaborate detours around a simple truth. Women had sexual lives whether society acknowledged it or not, but don't let the absurdity erase the weight of it. These treatments weren't framed as empowerment. They reinforced the idea that women's bodies weren't theirs to interpret. Doctors became gatekeepers of what was acceptable, transforming natural urges into signs of disorder. In doing so, they stripped women of the chance to name their own experiences. You weren't curious, you weren't passionate, you were ill, and that label gave men the power to touch, prod, and control under the guise of medicine. Of course, not every woman went along quietly. Some patients wrote in private journals about the ridiculousness of it all, or whispered about the relief treatments provided. Others quietly refused to see doctors, relying instead on homemade remedies or nothing at all. And then there were those who took the medical system at its word, convinced that their desires truly mark them as disordered. Imagine the confusion. Part of you feels pleasure, but another part insists that the very pleasure is evidence of your brokenness. The debate lingers today. Were Victorian women secretly in on the joke, understanding more than they admitted? Or were they so steeped in cultural repression that they genuinely accepted hysteria as a diagnosis? Historians sift through records, diaries, advertisements, each clue a fragment of a much bigger puzzle. What remains clear is that medicine and morality dance together in awkward lockstep, producing treatments that tell us far more about cultural fears than about biology. As you leave the doctor's office in your imagination tonight, the street outside seems the same, cobblestones damp with drizzle, horses clattering past, but you feel different. Part of you is relieved, though you're not sure why. Part of you feels guilty, because desire has no official name except sickness. And part of you burns with unspoken rebellion, because deep down you know you're not broken. You're simply human. And that, in the Victorian world, might have been the most dangerous truth of all. You've just left the doctor's office. Your so-called illness soothed in ways no one dares describe openly. But where can you actually be honest? Not with your husband, who expects purity laced with obedience, Not with your mother, who would faint faster than you in a too tight corset. Certainly not with your priest, unless you're ready for a lecture about eternal damnation. No, your only confidant is the silent, waiting page of a diary. Ink becomes your secret lover, paper your accomplice, and the lock on the little leather book is the only protection between you and scandal. That's the thing about diaries in the Victorian era. They were everywhere. Girls received them as gifts, delicate volumes bound in embossed covers, often with brass clasps. They were meant for recording daily events, needlework progress, or Bible reflections, but very quickly they became much more, private spaces where women whispered to themselves the things society insisted they never say aloud. Here's your historical fact. The diaries of women like Anne Lister, hidden in coded language, reveal same-sex desire, longing, and encounters carefully recorded and concealed. These writings didn't just survive, they exploded the myth that Victorian women were universally passive and uninterested in passion. And here's a quirky fringe fact. Some diaries were written in elaborate ciphers, with women inventing codes no one else could crack. One even used a mix of Greek letters and numbers, turning her writing into a puzzle only she could solve. Imagine pouring your heart out, then immediately scrambling it like an encrypted love letter to yourself. It's both brilliant and heartbreaking, proof that the act of confessing was allowed only if hidden under layers of disguise. But historians debate how much we should read these diaries as raw truth. Some argue that even in private, women censored themselves, shaping their words in case their books were discovered. Others suggest diaries gave freer rein than any conversation ever could, becoming the one place women could engage with their desires honestly. Were these coded passages authentic outpourings, or carefully managed double lives? The ambiguity lingers, leaving us reading between lines, always aware of the risks hovering over every word. Picture yourself at a small writing desk, candle flickering low. You open your diary, smoothing the paper like skin, and dip your pen into the inkwell. Today you smiled too long at the postman. You laughed too loudly at a joke told by a cousin. You felt a heat in your chest you couldn't explain when someone's hand brushed yours during a dance. None of these moments can be said aloud, but here, on paper, you can write them, carefully, cautiously, in a code you pray no one else will understand. The act of writing is itself thrilling. Each word slides out like contraband. You hesitate, nib of the pen trembling, then commit the thought to ink. In this ritual you've created a parallel life. One is the life people see, proper, composed, duty-bound. The other is this shadow life of words, restless, yearning, sometimes messy. The two exist side by side, never touching, except in the diary's pages, where they meet in secret, and sometimes you're funny about it. One diary entry might read, "Today I had an excess of nerves." Translation: I thought about him all afternoon and couldn't sit still. Another says, "My health remains unsettled." Translation: I can't stop wanting something I can't name. It's like Victorian women invented their own brand of stand-up comedy, except the punchlines were disguised in genteel handwriting. The risk, of course, was discovery. Stories circulated of siblings or servants stumbling upon diaries, of mothers intercepting them, of husbands reading too much into cryptic passages. The thought alone could make your stomach drop, which is why some women burned their volumes before death, ensuring no future biographer would pry. Others left them tucked away in trunks, either forgotten or secretly hoping someone would someday read them and finally see them whole. Imagine the satisfaction, though, of rereading your own words years later. You're older, maybe settled into marriage, maybe home somewhere. Maybe hardened by disappointment. You open a diary from your youth and find that trembling, daring girl again. Her longing jumps off the page, reminding you that even if society won, even if silence swallowed much of your life, there was always a corner of truth that belonged to you. And here's the beautiful irony. What was once written in secret now forms some of the richest historical evidence of female desire in the Victorian era. The very words women feared would condemn them have become the proof that they existed fully, restlessly, passionately. Scholars pore over those ink-stained pages, trying to reconstruct the lives hidden beneath polite smiles. Each diary becomes a ghostly voice whispering across centuries, reminding us that longing never truly disappears, it just changes its hiding place. So tonight, as you close the little book and tuck it beneath your pillow, you feel lighter. No one has heard your confession, but you've heard yourself. In a world that tried to silence you, you've carved a space of honesty, even if only between you and the paper. Desire, at least here, isn't an illness or a scandal. It's simply ink, looping across a page, stubbornly real. You've confessed to your diary, but step outside your bedroom, and you're expected to embody something much more rigid. The angel in the house. This wasn't just a casual nickname, it was a Victorian cultural mandate, carved into sermons, poems, etiquette manuals, and the minds of mothers raising daughters. The angel was pure, selfless, delicate, and obedient. A woman without want. She existed only to nurture, to soothe, to sacrifice. Desire? That didn't even make the angel's resume. If you felt a flicker of passion, you were expected to smother it as though it were a candle threatening to burn the curtains. Here's your historical fact. The phrase "the angel in the house" comes from an 1854 poem by Coventry Patmore, who practically canonised his own wife as the model of ideal femininity. In his verses, she was patient, virtuous, and endlessly giving, a living shrine to purity. The poem became wildly influential, cited in sermons, recited in parlours, and essentially weaponised against any woman who dared stray from the script. Imagine being immortalised not as a person, but as a metaphorical halo in someone else's fantasy of perfection. And here's the quirky fringe fact. Alongside the angel, Victorians were also obsessed with her dark twin, the fallen woman. Plays, novels, and art thrived on depicting prostitutes, seductresses, or women who strayed from virtue, usually punished in melodramatic fashion. This obsession created a bizarre cultural split. Women were either spotless angels or tragic ruins. No middle ground existed, which meant you were either hovering heavenward or spiralling into disgrace. Desire itself often tipped the scales, and once it showed, society was quick to classify you on the fallen side. Scholars debate how deeply this angel ideal truly penetrated everyday life. Was it an unattainable fantasy men projected onto women, or did women genuinely internalise it, shaping their lives around the pursuit of spotless virtue? Some argue that it was more rhetorical than practical, a pedestal that no one actually lived on. Others insist it seeped into everything, influencing not just marriage but education, charity, even how women wrote in their own diaries. The truth, as always, lies in the messy in-between. Some women embraced the role with pride, others rebelled, and most navigated a tense middle ground, keeping one wing tucked behind their backs. Now, picture yourself as the angel. You glide into the parlour with quiet grace, your gown a waterfall of pale silk, your voice soft as the coals burning low in the grate. You speak gently, laugh modestly, and tend to everyone else's comfort. Guests praise your refinement. No one asks if you're content. You've become a performance piece, carefully staged. Every gesture whispers, "I have no desires of my own." And when a flicker of longing stirs beneath the surface, you crush it, reminding yourself, angels don't burn, they glow. The angel ideal seeped into even the smallest rituals of daily life. Letters were expected to brim with affection, but never lust. Conversation with men had to sparkle just enough to flatter, but never enough to suggest hunger. Even motherhood was wrapped in angelic imagery. Mothers were saints in the nursery, not women who once had flesh and blood appetites. That erasure of the body was deliberate, turning real women into spiritualized icons, untouchable but also untouchably lonely. And let's be honest, the contradictions were ripe for humour. Imagine a woman being praised for her angelic purity while her corset squeezes her lungs, her face flushes with suppressed desire, and her diary upstairs contains enough coded longing to scandalise a bishop. The performance of the angel was both exhausting and at times laughably unrealistic. It's like being asked to play a role in a play with no script except, don't be human. But here's the darker side. The angel role became a weapon used to police women. Step out of line, laugh too freely, hint at independence, and you risked being pushed into the fallen category. The pedestal was high, but the drop was brutal. Once labelled as impure, a woman could lose her reputation, her marriage prospects, even her place in her family. The angel wasn't just an ideal, it was a trap. Yet in private, many women rejected or twisted the angel's script. Some leaned into it ironically, using the image of piety to cover secret lives filled with passion or intellectual ambition. Others confided in letters to close friends that they resented being cast as ethereal ornaments, and a few wielded the angel mask strategically, knowing that playing the part gave them social cover to pursue other desires undetected. If you're forced into costume, you might as well make it useful. So tonight, as you sit beneath the faint light of an oil lamp, you imagine folding those angelic wings away. They've been heavy on your shoulders, pinning you into a role you never asked for. You're not glowing, you're burning quietly beneath the surface. The angel may hover in sermons and poems, but you know better. You're not a haloed spirit. You're a woman with wants, scribbled into your diary, hidden beneath your corset, waiting for a chance to slip free. And the truth is, no matter how tightly the Victorian world clung to its angel ideal, it never fully managed to silence the heartbeat of desire under all that white muslin. The angel may have hovered in parlours and sermons, but behind closed doors, another kind of guardian waited, the hidden bookshelf. Outwardly, your collection is harmless. Volumes of Dickens, a Bible with gilt-edged pages, maybe a book of etiquette lectures thick enough to stop a bullet. But tucked behind them, or hidden inside false covers, lies contraband. Novels laced with the passion, poetry that smoulders, stories that whisper of forbidden kisses, and bodies that refuse to remain angelic. If the corset constrains your body, these books unlace your imagination. Here's your historical fact. Despite the era's reputation for prudishness, Victorian England produced a roaring trade in erotic and semi-erotic literature. Works like The Pearl, a clandestine magazine full of explicit tales, circulated among readers who knew just how to smuggle them. Booksellers faced prosecution under obscenity laws, but the demand never stopped. Even respectable novels like Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights scandalised readers with their brooding passion, towing the line between literary respectability and dangerous sensuality. For many women, slipping these books into their hands was the closest thing to holding desire without consequence. Now, for a quirky fringe fact, some women disguise their forbidden reading by rebinding erotic novels inside religious covers. You might open what appears to be a leather-bound book of Psalms, only to find yourself face to face with a scene of Parisian decadence. Others pasted lace trims into books to make them look like devotional scrapbooks, fooling prying eyes. Imagine your mother pulling a volume from your shelf, praising you for your devotion, while you're secretly reading descriptions that would make her swoon faster than a ballroom faint. But here's where scholars argue. Were these hidden readings a widespread rebellion, or were they rare indulgences enjoyed by only a daring few? Some claim that only elite women, shielded by wealth and privacy, could afford the luxury of contraband books. Others suggest that curiosity trickled down through servants and factory workers too, creating underground networks of whispered tales and dog-eared novels. It's a debate of reach versus exception. Was Victorian female desire fueled quietly across social classes, or was it the privilege of those with locked cabinets and clever disguises? Picture yourself sliding a volume off the shelf. Your hands tremble, though no one is in the room. You perch on the edge of your bed, candlelight pooling across the pages. The sentences begin politely enough, flowery prose, sweeping descriptions of landscapes, but soon the rhythm changes. A touch described too vividly, a breath captured in detail, the shadows between lines filling with suggestion. Your cheeks heat as though the words themselves are watching you. You glance at the door, certain someone will burst in, catch you, expose you. But the thrill is too sweet to close the book. There's a comedy to the secrecy. Imagine your diary entries now. Day, I read chapter 5 and had to fan myself repeatedly. The irony is delicious in a world demanding innocence. Even your choice of literature becomes a clandestine at a fair. Women joked in letters about being overcome by novels, fainting not from corsets this time, but from overactive imaginations. It was a performance layered on performance, but beneath it pulsed the real thing, a private awakening sparked by the ink and paper. The hidden bookshelf also became a testing ground for identity. Some women found their desires mirrored in male-female romances, while others lingered on the intensity of female friendships described with unusual heat. Some encountered queer subtexts, often cloaked in ambiguity, yet powerful enough to spark recognition. These pages weren't just entertainment, they were a mirror, showing reflections of feelings women had been told they weren't supposed to have. And then there's the risk, the constant humming risk. Obscenity laws were strict. A household discovered with illicit books might face not only social disgrace but also legal trouble. Servants might gossip, siblings might snoop, husbands might pry. Yet women still hid them, tucked behind sewing kits, slipped between mattresses, or disguised in hat boxes. Desire makes smugglers of us all, and in the Victorian world, the contraband was often no heavier than a slim novel. Imagine finishing one of these books, closing it with hands that feel suddenly warm, and sliding it back into its false cover. You sit still in the quiet, heart racing, ears straining for footsteps. Nothing. You're alone, and yet you feel less alone than you did an hour ago. Because those words, whether they described a kiss, a forbidden meeting, or something even bolder, have reminded you that longing isn't yours alone. It existed for others too, enough to fill entire hidden shelves. So tonight, as the candle sputters low, your secret bookshelf glows brighter in your mind than any halo. Angels may not burn, but books certainly can, at least metaphorically. You've discovered that sometimes rebellion doesn't look like shouting in the streets. It looks like turning a page slowly, carefully, with a breath held tight, knowing the story on the other side is one you were never meant to read but needed all the same. By now, your hidden bookshelf is whispering to you at night. Your diary is heavy with confessions, and yet, somehow, you still have to sit through the daily theatre of polite society. Enter the Victorian parlour, the stage where desire was never named outright but performed in sly, playful disguises. Imagine a room stuffed with velvet drapes, ornate chairs, and a faint smell of coal smoke. The piano gleams in the corner and the card table sits ready. Everyone's pretending they came here for polite conversation and a hand of whist, but let's be honest, you're here for the thrill of glances, touches, and the art of flirting without ever calling it that. Here's your historical fact. Parlours weren't just living rooms, they were carefully curated spaces where middle and upper class women presided. To receive visitors was part of a woman's social duty, and it offered rare opportunities for interaction between the sexes under controlled circumstances. Chaperones loomed in corners, but within the rules, subtle rebellions played out. A song choice at the piano, a strategic seat near the fireplace, a card game where fingers accidentally brushed. Now for a quirky fringe fact. Some Victorian parlour games were shockingly forward compared to the stiff manners surrounding them. Forfeits, for example, required players to perform tasks if they lost, sometimes reciting silly verses, sometimes giving a kiss. Another, Snapdragon, involved plunging fingers into flaming brandy to snatch raisins, all while shrieking and laughing in a room full of nervous energy. It's hard not to see the metaphor. Danger, heat, and pleasure mingling beneath the cover of tradition. It was like society handed out loopholes, little windows where desire could slip through without tearing the curtain down entirely. But scholars still debate just how much of this was deliberate. Were parlour games consciously crafted as outlets for restrained passion, or did people simply retrofit meaning onto them after the fact? Some argue they were innocent amusements, overinterpreted by modern readers hungry for evidence of rebellion. Others insist the Victorians knew exactly what they were doing, building safe ways to flirt, while pretending everything was above board. The tension between play and performance remains one of the great ambiguities of Victorian social life. Picture yourself seated at a card table. The air is thick with candle smoke and perfume, the chatter of polite voices masking the undercurrent of nerves. Across from you, a young man deals the cards, his hand steady but his eyes flicking toward yours with deliberate pauses. You hold your breath when his fingers graze yours, just long enough to feel something sharp and thrilling jolt through you. No one comments, but you know he knows, and the silence is its own kind of electricity. Then it's your turn at the piano. You choose a song, not the stiff, pious hymn everyone expects, but something a bit warmer, with a melody that lingers in the room like perfume. Your voice carries over the keys, and for a moment the parlour hushes. You know he's watching you, listening. The notes wrap themselves around the air, and even though the chaperones think they're supervising, you're engaged in your own private conversation with him, one chord at a time. Of course, the comedy of it all is delicious. Imagine Victorian youth, suffocating under endless etiquette lessons, finding freedom in the excuse of a game. Oops, I lost. I suppose I must accept a kiss as forfeit. How dreadful, wink wink. The line between decorum and daring was so thin it sometimes tripped right over itself. Even stern mothers couldn't outlaw laughter. And laughter often slipped into something warmer, cheekier, dangerously close to desire. The parlour in this way became a pressure valve. Society demanded women be angels in the house, silent and pure, Yet here they could laugh, tease, sing, and allow themselves tiny risks. A kiss stolen under the pretense of a forfeit wasn't the collapse of morality, it was its loophole. That loophole mattered. It gave women a script for desire, even if the script was wrapped in comedy and rules. But here's the rub. The parlour wasn't free. Every action was observed, every laugh measured, every glance catalogued. Your reputation hung in the balance. Flirt too boldly and whispers could follow you out of the room, haunting you into the marriage market. Play too coy, and you risk being overlooked entirely. It was a balancing act. Enough spark to intrigue, enough restraint to preserve angelic status. The parlour was both playground and prison. Now imagine the evening winding down, the candles gutter, the last notes of music fade, and the guests gather coats and hats. You stand at the doorway, cheeks flushed, saying your goodbyes. That brief hand clasp lingers longer than it should, carrying the weight of everything you couldn't say. When the door finally shuts and you're left in the quiet, your heart still drums with the rhythm of the game. You know it was just a parlour evening, just cards and piano and laughter, but inside it felt like something riskier. A rehearsal for passion, acted out in whispers and glances, hidden in plain sight. The parlour fades into memory, the faint scent of brandy and wax still clinging to your gown. But now we're going to descend a staircase that most Victorians pretended didn't exist. Down here, in the servants' quarters, the world turns upside down. The drawing rooms upstairs hum with etiquette manuals and angels in the house performances. But below the floorboards, reality is far less polished. The kitchens are warm, the air thick with steam and sweat, the corridors narrow and dim. And here, where the gaze of society loosens, desire creeps out from under the tablecloth. Here's your historical fact. In Victorian Britain, the majority of young women in cities worked as domestic servants. By mid-century, more than 1 million women were in service, cooking, cleaning, scrubbing, nursing, and carrying coal. They lived cheek by jowl with other servants, slept in cramped attic rooms, and followed schedules dictated by bells and bosses. Unlike their mistresses upstairs, they couldn't afford the luxury of angelic performance every moment, and in such proximity, intimacy inevitably bloomed, sometimes between servants and their employers. Now for a quirky fringe fact. Newspapers occasionally reported scandals involving servants caught in compromising positions, but one particularly strange story involved a maid discovered with her employer's son in the pantry, both hiding behind the excuse of searching for biscuits. The pantry, it seems, was a popular site of temptation, perhaps because it was the one room that could be entered under innocent pretences. Who knew baked goods could be such a convenient alibi? But historians debate what these liaisons really meant. Some argue they were exploitative, products of imbalance between employer and servant. Others point to letters and diaries suggesting genuine affection, or at least mutual pleasure in some of these relationships. Was it love, lust, survival, or all of the above? The debate reminds us that desire doesn't always fit neatly into categories of victimhood or empowerment. Sometimes it's a tangled knot of both. Picture yourself as a housemaid, apron dusted with flour, hair pinned hastily back. You've been up since dawn, your hands raw from scrubbing. Upstairs, laughter drifts faintly through the floorboards, but down here it's just you and the other servants. You lean against the cool wall of the scullery for a moment, exhausted, when the footman brushes past you carrying a tray. His sleeve grazes yours, and the warmth of it lingers longer than it should. Neither of you says anything, but the silence hums with possibility. Later you cross paths again in the corridor. Dim light, stone walls, no chaperones. His hand brushes yours again. This time deliberately. The thrill shoots through you, sharp as the chill seeping through the flagstones. There's no space for polite parlour games down here. Everything is more immediate, stripped of lace and etiquette. Maybe it's a kiss stolen in the pantry, or whispered words in the laundry room, steam curling around you like a curtain. For servants, desire is both riskier and somehow more alive. And here's where the humour slips in. Imagine the chaos of a household if everyone upstairs knew what was happening below. The mistress fusses over lace doilies while her butler sneaks glances at the cook. The master scolds the groom for tardiness while secretly eyeing the chambermaid. The entire household hums with double lives, each floor telling a different story. It's practically a farce, the kind of thing you'd see in a play where doors keep slamming and lovers barely miss getting caught. But behind the comedy lies tension. Servants who became pregnant face dismissal and ruin, their livelihoods gone in an instant. Gossip spread like fire through the household. The very same employers who indulged in private liaisons often turned around and condemned the women involved, branding them immoral or careless. Desire was tolerated in whispers, punished in daylight. It was a high-stakes game where a single misstep could cost you everything. Still, letters and memoirs suggest many servants carved out real romances, falling in love with fellow staff, meeting secretly after hours, even marrying. While the angel upstairs was trapped in ideals of purity, the servant downstairs sometimes lived closer to the raw truth. Desire as messy, physical, sometimes joyous. The irony is almost too sharp. The women society thought of as lower were often freer to feel what their betters locked in diaries and disguised on bookshelves. So tonight, as you sit in the servant's narrow bed, a single candle flickering, you hear the muffled footsteps above, masters and mistresses drifting through their curated lives. Down here, you're bone-tired, but you're also humming with the memory of a stolen moment in the corridor. You know the risks, you know the stakes, but for once, you're not thinking about angels or etiquette. You're thinking about your own body, your own pulse, your own secret hunger. And in this hidden world below the stairs, that hunger feels more real than anything happening on the floors above. The house above is a maze of rules, the scullery below a tangle of risk, and somewhere in between there's a door that doesn't belong to the household at all, the convent gate. You pause there in your mind, fingers grazing ironwork cool as river water. On the other side lies a world that promises to soften the noise. No parlour games, no pantry alibis, no chaperones breathing down your neck. Just stone silence and the idea, glorious, terrifying, that desire can be disciplined into prayer. You step across and the air changes, beeswax and lavender, the faint scorch of candle wicks. Footsteps swallowed by flagstones. You feel your shoulders drop, the way they do when you finally loosen the corset laces at night. The difference is that here, the laces you loosen are social ones. Here's your historical fact. In 19th century Britain and across Europe, Catholic convents offered refuge for women who didn't marry, couldn't marry, or flat out refused to. Protestant England eyed them with suspicion, but the expansion of Catholic orders in the Victorian era drew women seeking education, discipline, and a life outside the domestic script. Joining a convent didn't just mean giving up marriage, it meant rewriting your role entirely. You weren't a wife, you weren't a spinster, you were a bride of Christ, and the veil offered both safety and erasure. Now for a fringe fact, Victorian novels and rumours were fascinated, almost obsessed, with the idea of nuns hiding forbidden passions. Gothic stories painted convents as hotbeds of secret affairs, repressed longings, even ghostly punishments for women who couldn't tame their bodies. The most lurid tales claimed that underground tunnels connected convents to nearby monasteries, making it easy for monks and nuns to meet in the shadows. It was mostly fantasy, but the popularity of such stories tells you everything about how people imagined women's desire. So strong it had to be exiled behind cloister walls. Scholars still debate whether the convent was liberation or imprisonment. On one hand, women could pursue education, leadership and community without the marriage market looming over them. On the other, vows of chastity and obedience meant surrendering bodily autonomy to a different authority. Was the convent a safe house for women escaping patriarchal marriage, or simply another cage disguised as sanctuary? The answer seems to shift depending on whose letters you read. One nun's peace was another's slow suffocation. Picture yourself walking down a convent corridor. The walls are whitewashed, cool to the touch, and light filters through narrow windows. You hear the rustle of habits, the soft murmur of prayer. The rhythm of the place is hypnotic. Bells calling for matins, then work, then vespers. In this order, your restless thoughts should quiet, but they don't. Instead, they pulse beneath the psalms. That familiar ache, the one you've buried in diaries and hidden behind polite laughter, doesn't disappear. It only changes form. In the hush of the chapel, as your voice joins the choir, you realise longing can sound suspiciously like prayer. There's a comedy hidden here too. Imagine a Victorian girl sent to a convent school for discipline, only to discover that she develops a crush on the music teacher, a nun with striking eyes and a smile that lingers. The parents imagine their daughter cloistered safely away from temptation, while temptation has simply swapped trousers for a habit. The irony practically writes itself. The stricter the wall, the more cracks you find for desire to seep through. The convent also complicates friendship. Letters between nuns often brim with devotion that modern readers can't help but read as romantic. Phrases like, "My heart longs only for your embrace in heaven," blur the line between spiritual and physical. Were these purely religious expressions, or was there something else shimmering underneath? Historians still argue, but one thing is clear: the convent gave women language for passion, even if the words wore the costume of piety. And then there's the question of power. Upstairs in the drawing rooms, women were meant to submit to husbands. Downstairs in the kitchens, they submitted to employers. But here, abbesses ran entire institutions, managing schools, hospitals, and finances. Desire in the convent wasn't always carnal. Sometimes it was the fierce hunger for authority, for independence, for a life not dictated by male guardianship. Maybe that's its own kind of passion, the thrill of being the one holding the keys. As evening falls in your imagined cloister, you kneel on the stone floor, candles flickering around you. The chant rises and falls, filling the air like breath. For a moment you almost believe you've quieted everything inside, but when you close your eyes, the silence hums with a different rhythm, one that no hymn can smother. Maybe desire doesn't vanish in the convent. Maybe it just takes on a new disguise. Sometimes prayer, sometimes power, sometimes the gaze you shouldn't linger on too long. Whatever name you give it, it still burns, soft but insistent, even behind these stone walls. The convent walls fade from view, the echo of chants still caught in your ears, and now you're back in the wider world where debate rages not in chapels but in lecture halls, medical offices, and dinner table conversations. It's the 19th century, and the question rattling around in hushed tones and stern-faced journals is this: do women actually enjoy sex? It sounds absurd to ask, yet for the Victorians it was an open controversy, a cultural tug-of-war between angelic ideals and inconvenient realities. Desire once again becomes a problem to solve rather than a fact to accept. Here's your historical fact. Many prominent Victorian physicians and social reformers argued, with straight faces, that women were naturally passionless. They claimed the female body was designed for reproduction, not for pleasure, and that true women felt little to no sexual desire at all. This passionlessness theory was touted as scientific fact and conveniently aligned with the angel in the house ideal. Yet others, often doctors treating real patients, countered with evidence that women did indeed respond to intimacy. Thus began decades of medical tug-of-war over something women themselves already knew perfectly well. And now, your quirky fringe fact. At least one Victorian doctor argued that women who enjoyed sex were in danger of being classified as nymphomaniacs, a medical condition supposedly marked by insatiable desire, dangerous to both morals and health. Treatments included everything from cold baths to clitoridectomy. Yes, some physicians seriously recommended surgical removal of offending anatomy as a cure for what they considered pathological desire. It's a chilling reminder of how far fear of female sexuality could spiral when cloaked in scientific authority. Scholars still wrestle with the meaning of all this. Was the myth of female passionlessness genuinely believed by most? Or was it a polite fiction people clung to while ignoring lived realities? Some argue it was a middle and upper class fantasy, a way of distinguishing respectable women from prostitutes, who were painted as hypersexual. Others suggest it was propaganda, a cultural muzzle designed to suppress women's voices about their own experiences. The debate lingers. Were Victorians truly that naive, or were they simply lying to themselves in public while indulging in private? Picture yourself overhearing one of these debates in a drawing room. The men puff cigars, their voices heavy with authority, declaring what women truly feel. One insists you are passionless, another counters with anecdotes from medical practice. Meanwhile, you sip your tea silently, your face serene. Inside, you roll your eyes so hard they nearly rattle. After all, no one has thought to ask you directly, and if they did, could you even answer honestly without risking everything? So you let them debate, while your body carries its own private testimony every time it stirs with longing you're forbidden to name. The humour, if you squint, lies in the absurdity. Men in waistcoats holding conferences to decide whether women enjoy sex, as though it were a geological phenomenon requiring survey. Imagine them debating rainfall patterns with more seriousness than they grant to women's lived truths. The more they insisted on women's passionlessness, the more energy they poured into constructing medical manuals, moral tracts, and cautionary tales to keep the idea alive. It's like inventing an entire bureaucracy to prove unicorns don't exist. Yet for women, the consequences were anything but funny. A wife who expressed desire could be branded indecent. A young woman who hinted at interest risked her reputation. Even within marriage, Many men expected wives to remain passive, treating female pleasure as irrelevant, or worse, dangerous. And so many women adapted, playing the angelic role outwardly while experiencing their own bodies in silence, their diaries and secret books carrying the truth society denied. Still, cracks appeared. Letters, memoirs, and even medical case studies occasionally record women describing pleasure in frank terms. Some admitted it hesitantly, with guilt. Others claimed it proudly, defying expectations. These voices, though rare, remind us that passionlessness was never universal. It was an ideal, not a reality, and reality has a way of refusing to be neatly tucked away. So tonight, as you imagine yourself slipping between starched sheets in a Victorian bedroom, you feel the heavy weight of this debate pressing on you. If you admit to desire, you risk being seen as diseased. If you deny it, you're a proper angel, but at the cost of your own truth. Either way, the conversation happens over your head, your voice absent, your experience rewritten by others. But deep inside, the body keeps its secrets. And no matter how loudly the world debates, it can't erase what you know in the quiet. That desire is real, whether they give you permission for it or not. The lecture halls may echo with debates about whether women are passionless, but meanwhile, in quieter corners, something far less theoretical stirs. Friendships that feel a little too warm, letters that read more like love notes than casual correspondence. In the Victorian world, female friendships were celebrated as pure spiritual bonds, so celebrated in fact that they often slipped under the radar even when they were charged with desire. This was romantic friendship, a term that sounds quaint until you actually read the letters and realise these women were pouring out emotions most people today would recognise instantly as something deeper than simple camaraderie. Here's your historical fact. Women like Lady Mary Wortley Montagu and later Anne Lister, whose coded diaries spilled far beyond friendship, left behind accounts of intense, lifelong bonds with the other women, bonds that often blurred into the erotic. In the 19th century, such attachments were not only tolerated but praised, provided they were framed as innocent sisterly devotion. The cultural blindness, willful or not, gave women a rare loophole. They could write letters dripping with passion without instantly being branded scandalous. And here's the quirky fringe fact. Some women wrote entire volumes of poetry dedicated to their female friends, publishing them under the guise of sentimental literature. Take the poet Michael Field, actually two women, Catherine Bradley and Edith Cooper, aunt and niece, who lived together as lovers and wrote collaboratively. They presented themselves as a single male author, but their works brimmed with desire directed at each other. Victorian society applauded their genius, while missing, or perhaps pretending not to notice, the erotic current running through their lines. But scholars still debate how to interpret these friendships. Were they genuinely erotic, or are modern readers projecting sexuality onto what was simply a different style of intimacy? Some argue that Victorians allowed for more flowery expressions of affection, without automatically assuming physical involvement. Others insist that given the secrecy around desire, these friendships were often exactly what they look like. Coded love stories lived out under the safety of social blindness. The truth is probably a spectrum, with some letters remaining platonic and others burning at the edges. Now imagine yourself sitting at a small writing desk, pen poised above paper. You've just returned from a walk with your closest friend, her arm brushing yours, her laugh still ringing in your ears. You ache with something you can't fully name, so you pour it into ink. Dearest, I find myself longing for your presence even as I write. How empty the hours feel when you are not near. You know you can send this letter without scandal, society will nod and call it sweet, even wholesome. Yet between the lines, you recognise something sharper, something that makes your hand tremble. The letters themselves are practically love stories. Some speak of yearning to share a bed, of clasped hands that lingered too long, of kisses exchanged under the excuse of affection. Others are subtler, dripping with metaphor, comparing a friend to light, warmth, salvation. And while the outside world applauds the poetry of it all, you and she both know what you mean. The letter becomes a double text, innocent on its face, incendiary in its undertones. There's humour in this too. Imagine the Victorian father who intercepts one of these letters, scans a line like, "I burn with the memory of your lips," and thinks, "Ah yes, such devoted gal pals." The blindness is almost comical, though perhaps it was willful. People saw what they wanted to see. If a daughter was writing to another woman, At least she wasn't out chasing unsuitable men. Better a too ardent friendship than a scandalous elopement. Yet the risks were still real. Too much intensity could spark gossip, especially if friendships overshadowed marriages or stretched beyond youthful years. Letters could be confiscated, interpreted, misused. Some women destroyed their correspondence later in life, fearful of how future readers might twist their words. And yet others preserved every scrib, unwilling to erase the truth of what they felt, even if the world wasn't ready to understand. Picture a reunion after weeks apart. You and your friend embrace, too tightly, too long. Her scent lingers on your clothes. Her touch makes your skin hum. Later, when you write about it in your diary, you'll call it a joy beyond words, but in your body you know exactly what it was. Desire disguised as devotion. It may not have a name you can say aloud, but in that moment it's undeniable. So tonight, as you fold one of these letters and press it to your lips before sealing it, you feel a thrill that has nothing to do with angels or hysteria doctors or marriage markets. This is yours, unofficial, unrecognized, but real. A passion that hides in plain sight, carried safely under the label of friendship, yet sparking with everything friendship isn't supposed to contain. And maybe that's the quietest rebellion of all, loving fully in a world that refuses to admit you can. The letters still smell faintly of sealing wax, the ink not yet faded. But let's turn our gaze to another realm where desire slipped past the senses. Art. You're in a Victorian gallery, polished parquet floors gleaming under your boots, gas lamps throwing buttery light across oil paintings that drip with allegory. To the casual visitor, it's all biblical scenes, classical nymphs, portraits of noble families. But linger long enough and you start to notice something else. The curve of a wrist rendered with aching attention, the lips parted just so, the fabric sliding suspiciously low on the shoulder of a goddess. Art became one of the safest and most public ways for desire to stretch its cramped legs. Here's your historical fact. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a group of artists in mid-19th century Britain, painted women with a sensual intensity that shocked polite critics. Dante Gabriel Rossetti's languid muses, with their heavy hair and dreamy eyes, practically mouldered off the canvas. Though the official line was that these works elevated beauty and myth, many viewers recognised the undercurrent of eroticism. The Victorians may have been repressed in word, but they were often scandalously expressive in pigment. Now for a quirky fringe fact, Rossetti's wife, Elizabeth Siddal, who modelled for many of his paintings, was once posed floating in a bathtub of water for his iconic Ophelia. The water grew cold, she caught a severe illness, and Rossetti, too absorbed in his work, didn't notice until it was nearly too late. Art demanded suffering, apparently, but the resulting painting glows with a beauty so intimate it still unsettles viewers. Desire and danger bound together in paint and circumstance. But scholars argue about intent. Were these works coded acts of rebellion against the angel in the house ideal, deliberately showing women as sensual beings? Or were they male fantasies, pinning female bodies to canvas without granting them agency? Some critics see them as empowering, others as exploitative. The debate is like the paintings themselves, layered, ambiguous, shimmering with contradictions. Now imagine yourself standing in that gallery. You approach a painting of a mythological figure, say, a reclining Venus. Officially, you're admiring classical artistry, the skill of brushstroke and composition. Unofficially, your pulse quickens at the sight of bare skin, the way the artist's eye lingers on curves in a way you recognise from your own secret glances. No one says a word, no one needs to. You cough politely, adjust your shawl, but inside you know you've just witnessed a public display of desire in a society that pretends it doesn't exist. Art wasn't limited to canvas. Poetry thrived with similar double lives. Christina Rossetti, Dante's sister, wrote devotional works, but also poetry laced with longing, ambiguity, and bodies that refused to stay angelic. Some verses were interpreted as spiritual allegory, but others quiver with earthly hunger. The Victorians lived in a constant state of plausible deniability, always pretending not to notice the pulse running just beneath the surface. And of course, the humour of it all, respectable families bringing their daughters to see paintings of half-naked nymphs while loudly proclaiming the moral lessons of mythology, is the 19th century version of the saying you read a magazine for the articles. Everyone smiles serenely, no one acknowledges the flush creeping into their cheeks. The gallery becomes a theatre of restraint, where desire masquerades as culture. For women, though, art offered something powerful. You could stand before a painting and feel stirred without blame, the excuse of aesthetic appreciation shielding you. You could copy verses into your commonplace book, quoting them under the guise of literary taste while savouring their double meanings. You could even dabble in your own sketches, pouring what you couldn't say aloud into lines of charcoal and strokes of paint. The act of creation became its own form of release, a way to claim your desire without anyone else naming it for you. Picture yourself back in your bedroom leafing through an illustrated volume of poetry. The engraving shows two women clasping hands, faces close, eyes locked. The caption calls it friendship. You call it something else, though only in the privacy of your thoughts. The image hums with recognition, and for once, you don't feel entirely alone. So tonight, as you step out of that gallery in your imagination, the gaslight flickering on the wet pavement, you realise something. Art doesn't just decorate walls or books. It becomes a loophole, a mirror, a whispered confession disguised as culture. The Victorians may have built high walls around female desire, but painters and poets carved peepholes through them, small enough to be deniable, large enough to let the light in. And in that light you catch yourself staring a moment too long, lingering where angels were never supposed to look. The gallery fades, but one detail from the paintings follows you out into the gaslit streets. The way fabric clings to the body, the way bare skin, just a shoulder, a wrist, can feel like a revelation. Victorians didn't need nudity to stoke scandal. They needed only a glimpse of what etiquette declared off-limits. Tonight we step into the strange theatre of fashion, where desire wasn't displayed openly, but teased through tiny cracks in propriety. In a world where angels were supposed to glide untouchably, sometimes all it took was the flash of an ankle to send pulses racing. Here's your historical fact. During the mid-19th century, skirts ballooned with layers of crinoline and later bustles, designed to exaggerate the waist-to-hip ratio. The more unmanageable the garment, the more it emphasised the forbidden allure of what it concealed. Women might wear as many as 6 petticoats, yet if a skirt snagged and revealed even a sliver of ankle, it could be enough to draw shocked gasps or fascinated stares. Newspapers even joked about ankle mania, mocking men who claimed to fall into swoons at the sight. And here's a fringe fact. Some women deliberately played with this boundary. Stockings were made in bold colours, scarlet, emerald, patterned silk, and though no one was supposed to see them, women still bought them. It's like wearing secret lingerie today. The thrill was in knowing what you hid beneath the proper layers. There's even a record of a London court case where a woman was accused of being indecent simply for lifting her skirt slightly too high while boarding an omnibus, exposing stockings patterned with clocks, little vertical lines that drew the eye upward. Imagine being dragged into scandal over your hosiery design. Scholars still debate whether these fashion scandals reveal women's agency or just society's obsession. Was a woman truly teasing when she adjusted her skirts, or were men projecting desire onto every accidental glimpse? Some argue women use clothing deliberately, pushing the boundaries with daring cuts, fabrics, or flashes of skin. Others insist the fetishization of ankles and wrists says more about men's hunger than women's intent. Either way, fashion became a stage where repression and desire collided. Picture yourself walking down Oxford Street in a crisp new gown. The bustle sways rhythmically behind you. The corset cinches. The gloves squeak faintly as you adjust your parasol. Every inch of you is covered, from neckline to fingertips, yet you're acutely aware of how your body is moving beneath the fabric. The silk whispers against your thighs with each step, and when a gust of wind threatens to flip your hem, your heart leaps, not just from fear of impropriety, but from the jolt of what it might reveal. The comedy here writes itself. Imagine men in top hats practically tripping over each other at the sight of a woman's ankle, as though they'd glimpsed a forbidden Eden. Victorian magazines made fun of it constantly, but the exaggeration only confirmed how electrifying the smallest reveal could be. In a society where angels floated above desire, the ankle became the devil's playground. But fashion wasn't only about concealment and reveal, it was also about shaping the body into ideals of desire. Corsets created impossible waists, bustles, exaggerated hips, and padded bodices sculpted curves. Every line of fabric transformed women into living sculptures of longing. The paradox is sharp. Society demanded female purity while clothing women in garments explicitly designed to sexualize the silhouette. You weren't supposed to want, but you were required to embody want for others. And in private, women responded to fashion with their own sense of play. Some giggled in letters about daring to wear lower necklines or brighter fabrics than a propriety allowed. Others invested in undergarments meant never to be seen, savouring the secret. A red petticoat hidden under layers of white muslin might be your only rebellion, but what a delicious rebellion it was, a little fire beneath the angel's robes. Imagine yourself at a ball. Candlelight flickers across the silk gowns, jewels glitter in hair. You descend the staircase, aware of every eye turned toward you. Your bodice dips lower than your mother would have approved. Your sleeves slip back just enough to reveal wrists like pale invitations. When you move across the dance floor, skirts swaying, a flash of stockinged ankle peeks out. You catch the quick intake of breath from your partner. You smile demurely, as though nothing happened. But inside, you're glowing, not just from being looked at, but from the quiet thrill of knowing you controlled what they saw. So tonight, as you unlatch the dozen hooks of your gown and peel away layers until your body finally breathes, you realise Victorian fashion wasn't just about covering or revealing. It was about staging desire like a magic trick. 1 second hidden, the next hinted, always more powerful because it was incomplete. The angel may have worn white muslin, but beneath it, stockings gleamed red, lace whispered, and ankles flashed like forbidden lightning in a storm. The ball gowns and flashing ankles still linger in your imagination, but now we're stepping into another kind of fantasy, the exotic. Victorians adored tales of far-off lands drenched in spices, silks, and the thrill of the unfamiliar. To a woman trained to be an angel in the house, forbidden to even name her own desire, the East became a dreamscape where longing could be projected safely. These were not real places, of course, but Orientalist constructions, harems drawn with Western pens, desert tents lit with candlelight, women lounging on cushions with coal-lined eyes. Exotic fantasies let Victorians indulge in desire by pretending it belonged to the other. Here's your historical fact. Victorian Britain was steeped in Orientalism, a cultural fascination fueled by colonial expansion. Painters like John Frederick Lewis produced lush depictions of Middle Eastern interiors filled with languid women and sensual detail. Popular novels described harems with breathless intrigue, portraying them as spaces of excess and passion, everything the English parlour was not. These works blurred fact and fantasy, allowing readers, especially women, to taste desire vicariously through landscapes deemed foreign and therefore safe to imagine. And now for your fringe fact. Some women collected souvenirs from abroad, not just trinkets but fabrics and perfumes, that carried sensual connotations. A silk shawl from Cairo or rosewater from Constantinople could serve as a private prop in fantasy. Diaries describe women draping themselves in shawls and imagining distant lives where passion wasn't smothered by etiquette. It wasn't just travel, it was costume play, a temporary escape into roles their society denied them. Scholars debate whether these fantasies were liberating or complicit. On one hand, they gave Victorian women space to imagine freedoms unavailable at home, sensuality, luxury, escape from rigid morality. On the other, they often reinforced colonial stereotypes, turning the East into a backdrop for Western longings. Was it genuine rebellion, or simply desire outsourced onto someone else's culture? The answer, as usual, isn't neat. Exotic fantasies were both an escape hatch and a cage, freeing women's minds while flattening others' realities. Picture yourself lying on a chaise in your dim London bedroom. You've pulled a borrowed silk shawl over your shoulders, its fabric heavy, fragrant with dust and spice. You close your eyes and imagine yourself far from the fog and soot, transported to a harem chamber, described in a dog-eared novel. Cushions pile around you, music hums in the background, and you are no angel, you're indulgence itself. For once you don't feel guilty, because this isn't you, it's fantasy, cloaked in the safety of foreign disguise. There's comedy here too. Imagine prim English matrons gathering in drawing rooms, sipping tea while swapping stories about the Orient, fanning themselves as they whisper about harems. None of them has set foot beyond Dover, yet all pretend expertise, cobbling together bits of rumour, travel writing and pure imagination. Their husbands nod along, oblivious to the blushes blooming at every mention of veils and cushions. Desire gets away with scandal because it's wearing the costume of geography. For women who actually travelled, the fantasies were sharper still. Diaries of English women abroad describe moments of startling freedom. walking unveiled through streets where no one knew their name, or observing rituals that felt like invitations to reinvent themselves. Some of these accounts drip with longing, not always for people, but for the sheer possibility of being different. The act of imagining yourself elsewhere becomes an erotic act, stretching your body out of its costed confines. Of course, the risks of exposure linger. Reading novels about harems might be waved off as literary taste, but lingering too much on those passages, or dressing yourself too often in foreign silks, might spark whispers. What respectable woman dreams of being part of a harem? Yet precisely because it was so un-English, the fantasy carried its charge. You could indulge without admitting it was you at all. Just a story, just a curiosity. Now imagine returning from one of these reveries to your ordinary parlour. The curtains are stiff, the clock ticks with scolding precision. The tea grows cold in your cup. For a moment, you resent the starch of your gown, the smallness of your world. But tucked inside you is that private vision, the cushions, the perfume, the warmth of a gaze unhindered by duty. It fuels you, not because it's true, but because it lets you breathe. So tonight, as you fold the shawl and tuck it back into the drawer, the fantasy lingers. The East may be a projection, a painted mirage on a gallery wall, but it has given you something London cannot. A space where desire feels possible. It's escapism, yes, but it's also survival. And in a world that demands angels, even a fantasy of elsewhere can feel like salvation. The silks and shawls of exotic fantasy slip back into the trunk, but the longing they stirred doesn't vanish. In fact, it finds another outlet, one that doctors, priests, and mothers alike were desperate to stamp out. Tonight, you're stepping into the era's most panicked obsession, masturbation. The Victorians called it self-abuse, solitary vice, or the secret sin, and they treated it with the same alarm as plague or fire. For women whose desire was already doubted or pathologized, the idea that you might take matters into your own hands was not only unthinkable, it was to them civilization ending. Here's your historical fact. Medical texts of the mid-19th century warned that masturbation would cause everything from blindness to spinal deformity, hysteria, infertility, and even death. One of the most widely circulated treatises, Onania, anonymously published earlier but still influential in Victorian thought, described it as a slow poison corroding body and soul. Entire shelves of advice literature lectured parents to watch their children for signs of the habit, urging them to check bedsheets and keep hands above the covers at night. And your fringe fact, Victorian entrepreneurs got very creative in their paranoia, inventing anti-masturbation devices for women. These included spiked rings, locking chastity belts, and even alarms that would shriek if a sleeper moved their hands under the covers. Some contraptions were marketed to protect health, but they sound more like instruments of torture. The sheer effort poured into stopping women from touching themselves is almost comic in its hysteria, though darkly comic like a farce staged with iron shackles. Scholars debate what this panic really signified. Was it about genuine medical belief, misguided though it was? Or was it a smokescreen for controlling female bodies, a way to reinforce the idea that women's desire must always be channeled into marriage and reproduction? Some argue the panic revealed just how much masturbation was happening, despite the prohibitions, because honestly, why else invent an entire industry of devices to stop it? Others caution against assuming too much, noting that while manuals shrieked about the secret sin, real practices were more varied and less easily policed. Now imagine yourself as a Victorian girl, tucked in bed under heavy quilts, the fire in the grate low, the room thick with silence. You've been warned in hushed tones that touching yourself will ruin your health, but no one explained why. You only know the ache in your body, the restless energy that doesn't vanish with prayers. One night you give in, your hand moving cautiously, your breath catching. The relief is immediate, powerful, and terrifying. You lie frozen afterward, heart hammering, convinced you've damaged yourself permanently, that your body will betray your sin in the morning, yet the memory lingers sweet as honey, calling you back again and again despite the fear. The humour isn't far away though. Imagine a mother storming into her daughter's room at midnight, convinced the sound of shifting sheets signals doom, or a doctor scribbling earnest notes about abnormal stimulation of the nerves, while half his female patients show up with symptoms he unknowingly mislabels as hysteria. The gap between what was happening in bedrooms and what was written in journals is so wide it's almost slapstick, but the consequences weren't always funny. Some girls grew up carrying immense guilt, convinced their health troubles, headaches, fatigue, melancholy, were punishments for private indulgence. Others internalized the warnings so deeply that they never shook the fear of being broken. Yet in diaries and letters, you also find women whispering about the relief and the secret joy, refusing to let cultural panic erase what their bodies already knew. The truth was too obvious to suppress entirely. Picture yourself years later, married now, with a husband who approaches you as if intimacy is his right, not your shared pleasure. His fumbling doesn't touch the places you've already mapped in secret. You lie still, angelic on the outside, while privately recalling the forbidden knowledge of your own hand. Society calls it a sin, but you know better. It is survival, sanity, a small pocket of autonomy in a world that claims every inch of you. So tonight, as you pull the quilt around your shoulders in this imagined Victorian bedroom, you feel the double weight, the panic of warnings and the pulse of rebellion. Masturbation may have been treated as catastrophe, but behind every locked door, every heavy curtain, countless women were quietly rewriting the rules of their own desire. They weren't angels, they weren't patients, they weren't sinners. They were simply human, stealing moments of freedom with nothing but their own bodies. And no device, no sermon, no manual could ever quite take that away. The heavy quilt is still warm around you, but let's push past the bedroom walls and out into the wider world. Because if there's one thing Victorians feared almost as much as solitary vice, it was women moving around unsupervised. Travel for a woman wasn't just a change of scenery, it was a flirtation with freedom, a brush against forbidden possibility. Tonight, we'll wander with the women who dared to pack trunks, board ships, and slip out from under watchful eyes, finding not just landscapes but also space to let desire breathe. Here's your historical fact. The Victorian era saw a surge of women travellers, from upper-class ladies on grand tours to daring adventurers like Isabella Bird, who roamed the Rocky Mountains and the Middle East while chronicling her experiences. These journeys were often framed as educational or philanthropic, but they cracked open a door to independence. Far from parlour rooms and marriage markets, women could reinvent themselves, even if only temporarily, as explorers rather than angels. Now for a quirky fringe fact, some women documented not only geography but also flirtations abroad. Travel diaries mention handsome guides, fleeting encounters on trains, or the intoxicating thrill of speaking with men, or women, outside the rigid codes of home. A few even admitted that foreign climates seemed to awaken the blood, blaming the sun or the wine for desires they'd never confess in England. In other words, colonial heat wasn't just weather, it was a convenient excuse. But scholars debate whether travel was truly liberating or simply another extension of privilege. Was wandering the Alps or riding through Syria an act of rebellion? Or did it still occur within the safety net of wealth and empire? Some argue that travel gave women unparalleled chances to step outside gender roles. Others caution that it often reinforced them. Women were still expected to record impressions with delicacy, to marvel at ruins but never lose sight of propriety. The freedom was real, but so were its limits. Now picture yourself boarding a steamship at Southampton. The fog clings to the harbour, and the deck smells of salt and coal smoke. You're bundled in a travelling cloak, your maid hovering nearby, but for the first time in your life you feel unchaperoned. As the ship groans away from shore, England shrinks behind you. The air tastes different already, freer, riskier, tinged with the promise that once you land, no one will know if you laugh too loudly, linger too long in a stranger's gaze, or wander streets unescorted. Travel sharpens the senses. You walk through a marketplace abroad, overwhelmed by spices, fabrics, voices in languages you don't understand, and there he is, the guide, the merchant, the fellow traveller, his eyes catching yours without hesitation. In London, this would be a scandal. Here, it's just an exchange, nothing more, nothing less. But your pulse quickens all the same. Desire, which at home had to squeeze itself into parlour games and diary coders, suddenly breathes in open air. The comedy is in the excuses. Imagine writing home, "The Mediterranean sun has quite unsettled my nerves," when what you mean is, "I danced barefoot on the beach with someone I'll never name," or "The Italian wine is rather strong," meaning, "I kissed someone in a vineyard and plan to blame it on the Chianti." Victorians were masters of euphemism, and travel gave them even more material to cloak indiscretions. Yet travel wasn't always about fleeting encounters. Sometimes the desire was for independence itself, the thrill of riding a horse through unfamiliar mountains, hair unbound by bonnets, lungs filled with cold air that no corset could fully contain. Isabella Bird once described riding astride like a man in Colorado, scandalizing polite society back home, but reveling in the physical freedom it gave her. Was it erotic? Not in the conventional sense, but the body's exhilaration, the rush of autonomy, carried its own sensual charge. Of course, the risks lingered. Women abroad still had reputations to guard, still faced the threat of gossip, danger, even violence. A single rumour could follow them home, staining their names. But the very act of stepping beyond England's hedgerows carried a spark of rebellion. It was proof that angels could grow wings not to hover in parlours, but to fly across oceans. So tonight, in your mind's eye, you sit on the balcony of a pension in Florence. The air smells of jasmine and wood smoke. Street sounds rise faintly. Music, laughter, footsteps echoing on cobblestones. You're writing a letter home, filling it with polite observations about cathedrals and galleries. But between the lines, your pen trembles, because what you really want to capture is the warmth still lingering on your skin from a hand that brushed yours in the crowd today. You don't write it, of course, but you feel it, and that's enough. Travel doesn't erase desire, it amplifies it. It gives you space to feel what England forbids, to imagine yourself as more than an angel, more than a patient, more than a name in someone else's marriage market. For a few stolen weeks or months, you're simply a woman alive to the world, your body humming in rhythm with train wheels, waves, and footsteps in foreign streets. And when you return, the corset will feel tighter than ever, but you'll always carry the memory of that other life, where desire was allowed to walk freely beside you. The train wheels slow, the foreign perfumes fade, and before long you're back in London, or at least in its smoky heart, where one group of women refused entirely to be angels or patients or cloistered saints. Step onto the gaslit pavement outside a theatre, and you'll see them. Actresses, painted lips, daring gowns, voices pitched to carry across crowded halls. They weren't angels in parlours or servants in pantries. They were women on stage, flaunting rules with every gesture. And while polite society clutched its pearls, it couldn't look away. Here's your historical fact. Victorian actresses like Ellen Terry and Sarah Bernhardt were celebrities in their day, adored and gossiped about with an intensity modern influencers would envy. Their performances blurred lines between public and private, and their offstage lives, affairs, costumes, friendships, were fodder for endless newspaper chatter. Actresses lived outside the angel in the house ideal, embodying a figure Victorians both desired and condemned. Now your quirky fringe fact. Sarah Bernhardt kept a coffin in her bedroom in which she sometimes slept, claiming it gave her inspiration for tragic roles. She also kept wild animals as pets, including a cheetah and a boa constrictor. Society couldn't decide whether to be scandalized or enthralled, but her eccentricity only heightened her allure. She lived as though rules were mere props to be tossed off stage. Scholars debate the meaning of this flamboyance. Were actresses exploiting desire, using it as currency in a world that denied them respectability? Or were they subverting the very standards that hemmed in other women, claiming visibility and agency in ways unavailable elsewhere? Some historians argue actresses were empowered figures of female independence. Others warn that their fame was built on precariousness, always shadowed by the risk of scandal. Desire, for them, was both a tool and a trap. Picture yourself in the pit of a crowded theatre. The chandeliers blaze, the audience hums with anticipation, and then she appears, draped in velvet, eyes flashing, every movement rippling with controlled intensity. She recites Shakespeare, her voice rolling like thunder and silk at once, and the entire hall leans forward. You feel your breath catch, not just at the lines, but at the audacity of her presence. A woman commanding a room, her body and voice on full display, unapologetically alive. The comedy here is in the hypocrisy. Respectable men would publicly condemn actresses as immoral while privately showering them with flowers, jewels, and proposals. Respectable women were warned not to emulate them, yet they eagerly clipped photos of stage costumes to copy at home. The theatre was a mirror where society projected its desires, wagged its finger, then sneaked another look. For actresses themselves, life was precarious but thrilling. Many lived with lovers openly, refused marriage, or supported themselves independently, choices nearly impossible for women outside the stage. They paid a price in gossip and moral suspicion, but they also carved out lives where desire wasn't hidden in diaries or disguised as friendship. It strutted in costume, declaimed in verse, and bowed under applause. And audiences knew it. Imagine the rush of sitting shoulder to shoulder with strangers in the dark, watching a love scene unfold with a kiss held just long enough to make everyone's pulse jump. The boundary between performance and reality blurred, and rumours swirled. Was that kiss acted, or was it real? Did the passion on stage end when the curtain fell, or did it follow them backstage? The thrill was in not knowing, and in feeling complicit in the secrecy. For women in the audience, actresses could be both inspiration and temptation. Here was a woman living outside the angelic script, unafraid to be seen, to command, to feel. Some viewers left emboldened, scribbling about the performance in diaries with words like sublime or intoxicating. Others felt scandalised but couldn't stop talking about it afterward, the image of the actress lingering longer than they admitted. And then there was the actress herself removing her makeup in a small dressing room, the applause still echoing in her ears. Beneath the powder and costumes, she was still a woman navigating a world that alternately worshipped and despised her. But for those few hours on stage, she embodied something extraordinary. Desire unchained, unapologetic, alive in front of everyone. So tonight, as you leave the theatre in your imagination, the fog curling around gas lamps, you carry her image with you. She's no angel in the house, no parlour-bound ornament. She's fire in silk, daring the world to look and not look away. And in that, she reveals a truth the Victorians tried so hard to suppress. Women's desire can't be silenced. It can be staged, disguised, condemned. But it will always find its spotlight. The stage curtain falls, the applause fades, and outside the theatre, London keeps humming. Horse hooves clattering, street vendors shouting, gaslights haloed in fog. But now we're slipping into a different kind of Steppenbaum, one with no velvet curtains and no polite applause. Beneath the polished surface of the city, another London thrives. The brothel districts, shadow worlds where desire is openly transacted instead of whispered. Respectable society tried to pretend these places didn't exist, yet they pulsed at the city's heart, undeniable and essential. If the angel in the house represented purity, the brothel was her disowned twin, necessary, condemned and crowded. Here's your historical fact. By the mid-19th century, London was infamous for its sex trade. Estimates suggest tens of thousands of women worked as prostitutes, ranging from streetwalkers who braved dark alleys to high-class courtesans who entertained politicians and princes. The 1860s even saw the introduction of the Contagious Diseases Acts, laws that allowed police to detain suspected prostitutes and subject them to invasive medical exams under the guise of controlling venereal disease. These laws were wildly protested by women's rights activists like Josephine Butler, who argued they punished women while letting male clients walk free. And here's a fringe fact. Some brothels advertised themselves with outrageous creativity. One notorious London house reportedly offered tableaux vivants, live erotic scenes acted out in costume, from mythological dramas to biblical parodies. Imagine a drunken banker watching Eve in the Garden reenacted by half-naked performances while insisting it was art. Another brothel was rumoured to have themed rooms, one decorated like a rustic farm, another like an Egyptian tomb, because apparently Victorian men needed their fantasy with extra scenery. Scholars continue to debate the meaning of prostitution in this era. Was it simply exploitation, born from poverty and lack of opportunity? Or was it, at least for some women, a calculated way to claim financial independence in a society that offered almost no other options? Courtesans like Cora Pearl became wealthy and influential, using their status to bend the rules. Yet countless others lived in desperation, caught between hunger and stigma. Desire here wasn't just personal, it was economic, political, a transaction with lives at stake. Now imagine yourself on a foggy Soho street, shawl pulled tight. The gaslight flickers against peeling door frames, and laughter spills from behind shuttered windows. You hear footsteps, gentlemen slipping discreetly inside, collars turned up, eyes darting. Each man will emerge later into the same society that pretends such places are unspeakable. But for now, behind those doors, the rules flip. Women hold the cards, at least for an hour, trading what society forbids for the money it denies them elsewhere. Step inside in your imagination. The parlour is warm, crowded with plush furniture, the air thick with perfume and smoke. Women sit on sofas, gowns cut lower than angels would approve, voices playful, coaxing. They're actresses too, in their own right, but here the performance is franker. Some clients want flirtation, others seek what they can't find in their respectable homes. And the women? Some play along with weary calculation, others with a spark of control, enjoying the way men trip over themselves for their attention. Desire here is blunt, undeniable, stripped of diaries and euphemisms. The comedy, dark though it is, comes in the hypocrisy. Politicians who thundered about morality in Parliament by day were caught sneaking through brothel doors by night. Clergymen who preached about angels sometimes showed up as clients, their collars loosened. The same society that forced women into silence upstairs relied on the brothel downstairs as its pressure valve. Is almost farcical, except that for the women, the stakes were deadly serious. And yet, within this dangerous world, there were moments of subversion. Courtesans threw lavish parties, rode in carriages finer than those of duchesses, and published memoirs that scandalized readers. Their very existence exposed the hypocrisy of a culture that pretended women had no desire while eagerly consuming theirs for a price. They were both reviled and envied, living proof that women could wield desire not just as weakness but as currency. Picture yourself as one of these women for a moment. You know the dangers, the risk of disease, arrest, violence, but tonight as you lounge in a brocade chair, a glass of champagne in your hand, you also know you've earned more money in an hour than most governesses see in a month. A man across the room is staring at you as though you're a goddess. For once you're not an angel, not a patient, not a cloistered figure in someone else's story. You're fire, unapologetic even if the flame can't burn forever. So tonight, as you step back out into the fog in your imagination, the laughter fading behind you, you carry the contradiction with you. The brothel was both cage and escape, degradation and empowerment, ruin and survival. In its rooms, Victorian women dealt with desire in the bluntest way possible. They sold it, shaped it, performed it, and sometimes used it to seize a life society told them they could never have. And whether polite London admitted it or not, the city's heartbeat pulsed just as loudly here as it did in any parlour. The fog from Soho clings to your skirts as you walk, but another fear shadows you heavier than perfume or smoke: fertility. For Victorian women, desire always carried the ghost of consequence, and no consequence loomed larger than pregnancy. In a world where birth control was whispered about but rarely acknowledged, every kiss, every touch, every risky moment could ripple into scandal, shame, or the sheer exhaustion of bearing yet another child. Tonight, we step into that uneasy terrain, where longing was chained to reproduction, and women plotted quietly to loosen the knot. Here's your historical fact. Contraception in the Victorian era existed, but it lived in the shadows. Condoms, often made from animal intestines or rubber, were advertised euphemistically as French letters or marriage sheaths. Birth control advice circulated in coded pamphlets, like Charles Knowlton's Fruits of Philosophy, a small book that caused such an uproar in Britain that its republication led to the infamous Bradlaugh-Besant trial of 1877. Annie Besant and Charles Bradlaugh were prosecuted for obscenity simply for distributing information about contraception, though the trial ironically spread awareness even further. Now for a quirky fringe fact, some women relied on folk remedies that ranged from the plausible to the downright bizarre. Vinegar douches, sponges soaked in quinine, even drinking certain teas said to regulate the womb. There were also pessaries, homemade or purchased, that were inserted to block conception, sometimes made of wax or even half a lemon rind, acid and all. Imagine fumbling with citrus fruit in the candlelit privacy of a Victorian bedroom. The desperation and creativity both boggle the mind. Scholars debate how widespread contraceptive knowledge truly was. Some argue that lower and middle-class women were far savvier than official accounts suggest, passing methods through whispered networks of servants, midwives and neighbours. Others claim most women remained largely in the dark, leaving their bodies hostage to endless pregnancies. The truth is likely a messy spectrum. Some women experimented, others resigned themselves, and many endured a constant anxious dance between desire and dread. Picture yourself lying awake in a heavy four-poster bed, curtains drawn tight. Your husband snores softly beside you. Earlier, in a moment of intimacy, you felt the familiar clash, longing sharpened by fear. Will this month bring another child? Your body is still recovering from the last one, your back aches, your milk barely dried. You crave closeness, yet dread its cost. The warmth of desire curdles into worry. You think of the pamphlet you once saw at a friend's house, its words daring, forbidden, promising control of fertility. You didn't dare ask to borrow it, but the memory burns, and there's comedy here too, though it's tinged with desperation. Imagine a prim Victorian couple disguising a trip to purchase condoms as a polite errand for stationery, or a respectable housemaid sneaking to a chemist for feminine powders while praying no one recognises her. Even the euphemisms sound like bad jokes. Marriage sheaths, preventive appliances, French goods. If you say it vaguely enough, maybe no one will notice that you're talking about sex. Yet the stakes were dire. For wealthy women, another pregnancy might mean inconvenience. For working class women, it could mean ruin. Too many mouths to feed, too many children to clothe. And when contraception failed or wasn't available, whispers of abortion crept through alleys and tenements. Backstreet providers offered remedies, often dangerous, sometimes lethal. Officially, abortion was a crime. Unofficially, it was a fact of survival. And so desire was never free. It was taxed by the constant calculation of risk. For men, intimacy might be a moment's pleasure. For women, it was a gamble with their health, their futures, their very lives. Yet women still reached for it, still carved out moments of passion, still sought ways to separate longing from consequence. The very existence of lemon rinds, pamphlets, and euphemisms proves it. They weren't simply angels or patients. They were strategists, improvisers, survivors. Imagine now sitting with a circle of women at a sewing table. The conversation drifts politely around fabric and recipes, until one voice lowers, eyes flick to the door, and a whispered tip is shared. A certain sponge, a certain tea, a chemist who won't ask questions. You nod, heart racing. In that moment, the air is charged not with shame, but with solidarity. Desire might be policed in public, but here, in whispers, women share the keys to survival. So tonight, as you blow out your candle and lie in the hush of your bedroom, you feel the paradox pressing close. Your body aches with hunger, but your mind calculates costs. You are both lover and mathematician, both angel and contraband reader, both participant and resistor. Fertility shadows every touch, yet the flicker of rebellion in you insists on seeking desire anyway, even if it means trusting citrus fruit, pamphlets, or whispered recipes. Because in the Victorian world, every act of passion is also an act of defiance against the relentless demand to reproduce. The sewing table whispers fade, the lemon rinds and pamphlets tucked away, but desire doesn't only haunt the young bride's bed or the servant's pantry, it also lingers in the drawing rooms of widows, women who, by accident or design, slip outside the tightest cage of Victorian respectability. Widowhood, grim as it sounds, could become a strangely liberating season, one in which desire re-emerged with a freedom denied to younger women. In a world that prized virginity at one end of life and angelic chastity at the other, widows occupied an ambiguous middle ground, no longer innocent, but no longer tightly bound. Here's your historical fact. Widows were one of the few groups of women in the Victorian era who enjoyed more legal and social independence. Laws of coverture, which made married women extensions of their husbands, didn't apply once a husband had died. Widows could own property, manage finances, and even run businesses, roles denied to wives and daughters. And because their sexual experience was already a given, they weren't policed quite as strictly in matters of reputation. They might still be gossiped about, but they weren't trapped in the suffocating angelic pedestal in quite the same way. And here's a quirky fringe fact. Mourning customs required widows to wear black for at least a year, sometimes up to 2.5. But instead of hiding desire, the sombre attire often became oddly alluring. A woman draped in crepe veils and jet jewellery stood out in social settings, her grief making her mysterious, her black gowns cutting dramatic silhouettes. Some even joked that mourning was the most fashionable season of a woman's life. Imagine the irony. Society tried to brand you as bereaved only to make you irresistible. Scholars debate the meaning of widowhood in this context. Some argue widows were freer precisely because they were no longer under a husband's control, able to pursue lovers discreetly or even remarry with more leverage. Others caution that the independence was limited. Many widows still struggled financially, their reputations precarious. Was widowhood liberation or just another performance of constraint? Like so much else in the Victorian era, the truth sprawls untidily across both possibilities. Picture yourself in heavy mourning garb, seated in a parlour lit only by a coal fire. You sip tea politely while neighbours murmur condolences. Outwardly you embody grief, your veil a curtain between you and the world. But inwardly, you feel the stir of something you've kept locked away. No one expects you to perform innocence anymore. You've already crossed that threshold. For the first time, the idea of longing doesn't feel scandalous. It feels possible. The comedy here is subtle but delicious. Imagine the widow at a ball after her first year of mourning ends, finally allowed to wear half-mourning colours. Lavender, grey. She descends the stairs in satin trimmed with jet beads, and suddenly every eligible gentleman takes notice. Respectable matrons whisper behind their fans, "Well, she wasted no time," while those same matrons remember vividly what it was like to crave touch in silence. Widowhood becomes society's awkward blind spot. Women who are both free to desire and still respectable enough to get away with it. Some widows embrace this freedom boldly. Diaries and letters reveal remarriages chosen for love, affairs pursued without apology, even open declarations of preference for younger men. Others found their desires turned inward, writing of sensual dreams or private experiments they'd never dared as wives. The veil of mourning became both shield and cloak, a cover under which longing could flourish, less scrutinised than in the bright light of maidenhood. Of course, the risks remained. Too much public boldness could brand a widow as predatory, the infamous merry widow stereotype of plays and gossip columns. A slip in discretion might mean social exclusion, but compared to the costed expectations of brides and daughters, widowhood was an open window. You might breathe differently, laugh more freely, even flirt without fainting. In a culture obsessed with purity, grief gave you paradoxical permission to want again. Now, imagine yourself walking through a London park dressed still in black but with your veil pushed back. A gentleman approaches, not with cautious deference, but with genuine admiration. You smile, and this time you don't hide the warmth in your eyes. You've already played the angel, the bride, the patient. Now you're something else, a woman with history, with agency, with the right to choose. So tonight, as you remove your jet jewellery and fold away the black veil, you feel both the weight of loss and the strange shimmer of possibility. Widowhood isn't freedom in the fullest sense, but it is a crack in the wall. A space where desire can emerge without disguise. Society may call you mournful, but beneath the crape and shadow, you're alive in a way you haven't been allowed to be for years. The widow's veil flutters behind you as you leave the park, but our walk tonight doesn't head back toward townhouses or parlours. Instead, we turn down a narrow lane, the clatter of factories already echoing through the fog. The industrial world of the Victorian era wasn't just smoke and machinery, it was also a new space where women stepped outside their domestic cages. The working woman emerged, apron tied over soot-stained skirts, hands gone from labour. She wasn't an angel in the house, nor a courtesan in velvet. She was something else entirely, a woman with her own wages, her own exhaustion, and, most dangerously, her own temptations. Here's your historical fact. By the mid-19th century, millions of women worked in factories, mills and workshops. They produced textiles, matchsticks, garments, pottery, goods that kept Britain humming. These jobs were often brutal. With long hours, poor pay and dangerous conditions, the infamous match girls suffered from phossy jaw, a horrific phosphorus-related disease. Yet, factory life also gave women something almost revolutionary. Wages they earned themselves and daily independence from the constant surveillance of home. Now for a quirky fringe fact. Factory owners sometimes worried not just about productivity, but about flirtation on the floor. Reports complained of immodest laughter, couples sneaking into storage rooms, or groups of girls giggling over young male overseers. In some towns, moral reformers launched campaigns to rescue working girls from the supposed corruption of industrial life, as though a spinning jenny doubled as a gateway to vice. The irony? Many of those same reformers fretted more about ankle-length skirts riding up than about the missing fingers and lungs blackened by dust. And here's the scholarly debate. Were factories oppressive extensions of exploitation, or accidental incubators of female autonomy? Some historians emphasise the dangers, long hours, low pay, constant male supervision. Others point out that factory life let women delay marriage, control some of their earnings, and form social networks outside family control. Within those networks, Desire had room to grow, sometimes cautiously, sometimes recklessly. Picture yourself standing at a loom, the clatter of machinery so loud you can barely hear your own thoughts. The air is hot, heavy with the smell of oil. Across from you, a fellow worker wipes sweat from his brow, glancing your way. You pretend not to notice, but your pulse betrays you. At lunch, you sit near him, your bread and cheese tasting suddenly sharper. In this world of relentless noise and motion, even the smallest spark, an exchanged glance, a shared laugh, feels amplified, urgent. And yes, there's humour even here. Imagine reformers storming through factories, convinced every giggle is the evidence of moral collapse. One clergyman reportedly claimed mill girls were endangered by reading cheap romantic novels during breaks, as though words on a page could outpace the spinning machines. Spoiler, they could. To the moralists, everything was a threat. Books, laughter, friendships, while the girls themselves were busy surviving 12-hour shifts and sneaking moments of joy in the process. For many women, wages meant new choices. You might rent a room with friends instead of living under your father's roof, go dancing on weekends, even buy a ribbon or perfume with money no man could control. With freedom came desire, messy and exhilarating. Some women fell in love at factories. Others used their wages to meet lovers elsewhere, and sometimes the mere act of walking home after a shift, arm in arm with a friend, felt like rebellion against the angelic silence expected in middle-class parlours. Of course, risks were everywhere. Pregnancy outside marriage still carried crushing consequences, and working-class women bore the heaviest weight. A factory flirtation could mean dismissal, gossip, or poverty. Yet just as in drawing rooms and brothels, women improvised, relying on whispered contraceptive tips, on solidarity with friends, or simply on secrecy. Desire might be dangerous, but it was not avoidable. Now, imagine yourself at a Saturday dance in a smoky hall near the factory. The music is fiddled fast, your shoes scuff the floor, your skirts swing wider than propriety allows. For once, no overseer scolds, no bell dictates your movements. Your partner holds you close, his breath warm against your ear, and your body hums with a longing that no sermon could ever erase. The next morning you'll go back to the machines, the noise, the exhaustion. But tonight, for a brief stretch of hours, you're alive in a way that angels and reformers will never understand. So tonight, as you peel off the factory grime and slip into bed, your body aches with fatigue but also vibrates with something brighter. The working woman lived in hardship, yes, but she also cracked open new possibilities. Possibilities where desire could stretch its cramped wings. In the whir of machines, in the laughter at lunch breaks, in the crowded dances on Saturday nights, she carved out sparks of passion. Sparks that proved even among soot and noise, women weren't just labouring bodies, they were living, longing ones. The factory whistle dies down in your ears, and the clang of the looms fades into something altogether different. The hush of a parlour gone dim, the heavy scent of incense curling in the air. Tonight we're stepping into the world of séances and spiritualism, where Victorians gathered around darkened tables to hold hands, call on spirits, and, whether they admitted it or not, channel something more than ghosts. In an era that forced women's desire into silence, the séance became a strangely acceptable stage for bodies to tremble, voices to moan, and passions to manifest under the cover of religion and the supernatural. Here's your historical fact. Spiritualism exploded in the mid-19th century, beginning with the Fox sisters in America and sweeping across Britain. Séances became fashionable entertainment and among the middle and upper classes. Women often served as mediums, their supposed sensitivity making them perfect vessels for otherworldly communication. This role gave women a rare kind of authority. In candle-lit rooms, they commanded attention, spoke with the voices of spirits, and presided over gatherings where men deferred to their power. Now, for a fringe fact, séances could get very physical. Participants reported table rapping, sudden gusts of air, mysterious touches, even spirit hands that appeared in the dark. Some mediums allowed spirits to speak through them, which often meant deep breathing, shudders, groans, and trance-like states. Imagine a woman in a society that demanded composure suddenly writhing in ecstasy-like trances, while an audience nodded solemnly, convinced it was the afterlife speaking. For many it probably was spiritual, but the resemblance to repressed desire finding an outlet is almost too striking to ignore. Scholars debate how to interpret this overlap. Some argue spiritualism genuinely empowered women, giving them a platform to speak, perform and lead in a male-dominated culture. Others caution that it was still a constrained freedom. Mediums were admired only when possessed, their authority borrowed from spirits, not recognised as their own. And then there's the question of desire itself. Were these trances simply psychological states, or were they also covert expressions of bodily longing, safely disguised as religion? Picture yourself at one of these seances. The curtains are drawn, the gaslights dimmed. A circle of hands presses lightly together around the table. The medium closes her eyes, breathing deeply, and soon her voice drops into a low, trembling register. She moans softly, shivers ripple through her body, and the table creaks as though unseen hands were lifting it. The sitters lean forward, rapt. You, seated beside her, feel her grip tighten on your fingers. Electricity shoots up your arm. You're not sure if it's spirit or flesh, but either way, your body reacts, and no one in the room dares to name it for what it is. The comedy, as always, lies in the contradictions. Imagine the same matrons who scolded their daughters for passionate novels now gasping and fanning themselves in darkened parlours as the medium groans in trance, or clergymen denouncing seances from pulpits while sneaking into them at night, eager to see tables dance. Victorians cloaked desire in ghosts, and the ghosts obligingly knocked back. Some women used spiritualism for intimacy beyond flirtation. Mediums often had close female companions who served as assistants, protectors, or confidants. Letters between them sometimes blur with tenderness, their devotion framed as professional necessity but reading like passion. Others used seances to draw men closer, hands held longer than needed, glances exchanged in the candlelight. In a culture obsessed with restraint, the seance room was permission to touch, to tremble, to let bodies do things usually forbidden. And then there's the sheer theatricality. Imagine the moment the medium collapses dramatically into someone's arms, gasping that the spirit has departed. The room is charged, breathless, alive with something more than just metaphysics. People leave whispering about the supernatural, but many also leave with cheeks flushed, hearts pounding. They blame the spirits for stirring them. But perhaps it was something closer at hand. So tonight, as you imagine the seance ending, the candles snuffed, the sitters dispersing into the London fog, you linger in that room. The echoes of raps and whispers cling to the air, but so does something warmer. The memory of a hand gripping yours too tightly, the quiver in the medium's voice, the permission to feel without confession. Desire, dressed as a ghost, has walked freely among the living, and in a society obsessed with angels and purity, maybe pretending it came from the other side was the only way to let it breathe. The incense smoke from the seance still curls in your imagination. But tonight, the ghosts fade. And we're back in the doctor's office, or rather his tool shop. This is the part of the Victorian story that sounds like a parody but isn't, the invention of the vibrator. Yes, the very device now sold in glossy boxes with wink-wink advertising began as a clinical instrument, designed not for pleasure, at least not officially, but for medical relief. In a world where female desire was pathologized as hysteria, the vibrator was born as a treatment, and it tells you everything about how Victorians tried and failed to disguise passion in a white coat. Here's your historical fact. By the late 19th century, physicians complained of hand fatigue from the repetitive pelvic massage used to treat hysteria. In 1869, Dr. George Taylor patented the first steam-powered manipulator, a clunky machine that looked more like a sewing contraption than a bedroom toy. Later, portable electromechanical versions appeared, advertised as time-saving, efficient medical tools. For years, vibrators were marketed in women's magazines alongside curling irons and sewing machines, framed entirely as therapeutic devices for nervous complaints. Now for your fringe fact, vibrators were some of the first household appliances to be electrified, appearing before the electric iron or vacuum cleaner. Imagine that, your grandmother could have had a vibrator decades before she had a Hoover. The thought alone makes Victorian catalogues look like secret comedy sketches. For soothing relief of feminine nerves, plug in and enjoy. But scholars still debate whether women and doctors knew what was really happening. Some argue physicians were genuinely oblivious, convinced that inducing hysterical paroxysm was purely medical, not sexual. Others scoff at the idea, pointing to the obvious sensations involved. Did women go along with the medical charade knowingly, grateful for the relief? Or did they accept the story as treatment while privately treasuring the experience as something else? The uncertainty itself shows just how deep denial ran. Picture yourself in that consultation room. The blinds are half drawn, the doctor fusses with wires and switches, the machine humming faintly like a kettle about to boil. You're told to relax while the device is applied, your body betraying you almost immediately. A rush of heat, a wave of release, and the doctor, clipboard in hand, simply nods, declaring your symptoms relieved. No one mentions pleasure, no one dares, yet you leave lighter, flushed, strangely alive. You tuck the memory away where even your diary won't go. The comedy here is irresistible. Imagine rows of respectable matrons lined up at a clinic sighing with therapeutic relief while doctors maintain poker faces. Or consider the absurdity of department stores stocking vibrators as household goods, sandwiched between advertisements for toasters and hair curlers. Victorian society was so determined not to acknowledge female pleasure that it accidentally mass-produced a device for it. It's the kind of irony that feels like history trolling itself. Yet for women, the vibrator wasn't just funny, it was revolutionary. For once, desire didn't have to hide in bookshelves or cloisters. It could pulse through a machine sanctioned by medicine, free of sin. Of course, it was still framed as cure, not indulgence, but within that framing was an undeniable loophole. And loopholes, as we've seen again and again, were where Victorian women smuggled their truths. Imagine taking one of these devices home, tucked discreetly in its box. You tell visitors it's for relief of nerves. You demonstrate it's whirring innocently to a curious friend. But later, in the privacy of your bedroom, you use it without witnesses, without sermons, without aim. For once, the contradiction dissolves. The machine is both medical and sensual, both cure and secret joy. It is everything society insists cannot coexist. Angel and body, purity and pulse, wrapped up in a humming piece of brass and wire. So tonight, as you lie in your imagined Victorian bedroom, the machine cooling in its velvet case beside you, you feel both amused and defiant. The vibrator may have been born from hysteria, but it exposed the bigger hysteria, society's refusal to admit women's desire. And no matter how many euphemisms they invented, no matter how many catalogues disguised it as therapy, the truth vibrated right through the denial. Women wanted, women felt, and women found ways, steam-powered or electric or otherwise, to claim it. The hum of that machine fades into the background, but its echoes ripple outward into something bigger than a single consultation room. Because by the late Victorian era, women weren't just whispering their desires into diaries or disguising them as seances. They were starting to shout in their own careful, strategic way. Tonight we enter the world of suffragists and early feminists, where the demand for the vote, for property rights, for education, often carried a hidden, pulsing thread. The politics of sexuality. Desire was not separate from feminism, it was woven right into it, even when cloaked in sober speeches and pamphlets. Here's your historical fact. In 1869, John Stuart Mill presented a petition for women's suffrage to Parliament, signed by over 1,500 women. Behind that dry piece of legislation was a storm of organising, led by women who refused to remain silent. Campaigners like Josephine Butler didn't just fight for the vote, they challenged the Contagious Diseases Acts, arguing against the sexual double standard that punished women while excusing men. Their activism wasn't only about politics in the ballot box, it was about control over their own bodies. And here's your quirky fringe fact. Some suffragists deliberately dressed in ways that scandalised polite society. They wore rational dress, looser garments, sometimes even bloomers, claiming it was for health, but also enjoying the freedom of movement it provided. Imagine a rally where women are not only demanding votes, but also striding confidently without corsets, their very clothing declaring, "We are not your angels." It was rebellion stitched into seams, but scholars debate how openly early feminists engaged with sexuality. Some argue they avoided it, wary of scandal that could undermine their cause. Others point out the fiery language in private letters and speeches, hinting that demands for autonomy were inseparable from desire. Was feminism a polite movement about civic equality, or was it also a radical reimagining of female passion? The truth seems to be both, sometimes whispered, sometimes declared, always simmering underneath. Picture yourself at a suffrage meeting in a crowded hall. The air smells of ink and damp coats, the platform crowded with women whose voices rise over the noise of the crowd. One speaks of the vote, her words sharp and logical. Another, speaks of laws that bind women's bodies, her voice trembling with the anger. And as you listen, your heart beats faster, not just from the rhetoric, but from the sense of something new. Women standing together, demanding not to be angels, not to be patients, not to be hidden. The room hums with more than politics. It hums with possibility. And here's where the humour seeps in. Imagine newspapers mocking suffragists as unfeminine, drawing cartoons of them with oversized boots and shrill voices. Meanwhile, in real life, many were witty, stylish, and utterly unbothered. Some even turned the jokes back, laughing at the caricatures while marching forward. Desire itself became political fodder. Suffragists were accused of being either passionless spinsters or dangerously oversexed radicals. Apparently, women demanding the vote made men panic in every possible direction. Behind the speeches, friendships and partnerships formed, some romantic, some passionate, all forged in the fire of shared struggle. Women wrote to each other with tenderness, admiration, sometimes intensity that crossed into the language of love. Activism became not just about the vote, but about the bonds created in the fight, bonds that sustained longing as much as they sustained politics. And there was courage in making sexuality part of the argument. Campaigners against the Contagious Diseases Acts insisted that women had the right not to be treated as vessels for male pleasure or disease control. Feminists argued for access to education in biology and health, quietly pushing back against the myth of female passionlessness. Every pamphlet, every speech, every march was a way of saying, our bodies are ours, our desires are ours, and no law or sermon should deny that. Now imagine the meeting dispersing. You step into the damp night, the sound of boots on cobblestones, pamphlets crumpled in pockets. You walk alongside other women, laughing, linking arms, emboldened by the crowd. You've spent years hiding desire in diaries and behind corsets, but tonight, in the company of voices raised together, it feels less like a secret and more like a force. Desire has taken on a new form, not just longing for a touch, but longing for freedom itself. So tonight, as the gaslight flickers overhead and the rallying cry still echoes in your ears, you realise something important. The Victorian story of desire didn't end in silence or suppression. It cracked open into politics, into banners, into the beginnings of change. The suffragists may have spoken of laws and votes, but their fight carried the pulse of something deeper. The right for women to name, to feel, to own their desire without disguise. And that, perhaps, was the boldest rebellion of all. And now, after this long drift through parlours and diaries, corsets and seances, we arrive at the quietest part of the evening. You've followed women from the drawing rooms to the factories, from convent gates to suffrage halls, watching how each step, each whispered rebellion, bent the rules of a world that tried so hard to keep them silent. 30 chapters later, the thread tying it all together is clear. Victorian women never lacked desire. They lacked permission. And when permission wasn't given, they carved their own channels, ink onto page, a laugh in a parlour game, a shawl from a foreign market, even the low hum of a medical machine misnamed as therapy. The truth is, desire in the Victorian era was less about scandalous acts than about persistence. A body can only be corseted so tightly before it remembers how good it feels to breathe. A voice can only be silenced so long before it scribbles its secrets into code or chants them in protest halls. Even the so-called angel in the house, with her folded hands and halo, smuggled sparks of longing into her letters and dreams. For every rule there was a loophole. For every sermon, a quiet counter-story. And here's where you come in, lying now in your own room, the glow of a screen or the hum of a fan replacing candlelight and coal fires. The Victorians are long gone, their bustles and brothels folded into history books, but the tug-of-war between restraint and desire hasn't disappeared. We inherit their contradictions, the shame, the humour, the courage, just as much as we inherit their novels and portraits. Thinking about them isn't just history, it's a mirror, reminding you how much of what they felt still ripples through us now. So take a breath. Loosen your own figurative corset. Let the noise of their debates fade into the background hum of your room. The women we've followed are still here in a way, whispering through time, proof that desire always finds a voice, even if it's disguised, even if it's hidden, even if it's delayed for centuries. Close your eyes and let that knowledge settle soft as dusk. You're part of a very old story, one that's still unfolding.